There are nights in history when a single candle burns beside a ledger, and the shadow it casts stretches across centuries. Tonight, we open one of those ledgers. It is a book bound in storm-weathered leather, its pages brittle from salt air and ambition, its ink darkened by the weight of a continent's destiny. It bears no king's crest, no holy emblem, no signature of divine right. Instead, it carries something far more unsettling: the emblem of a company that began as a modest gathering of London merchants and ended as the most powerful corporate empire the world had ever seen. It is difficult to comprehend the scale unless you let yourself drift back in time. The clatter of wooden docks on the Thames, the acrid scent of pitch and wet rope, lanterns swinging over bales of pepper, cinnamon, and silk. In the quiet corners of taverns, men whisper about fortunes made on distant shores. They speak not of monarchs or generals, but of shareholders and dividends. They speak of a company with ships sharper than swords and contracts more binding than royal decrees. And then, almost imperceptibly, the story darkens. Those same ships return carrying not just spices, but soldiers. Not just fabrics, but entire provinces. Not just profits, but power. Power so vast that nations bowed before balance sheets, and emperors negotiated with clerks. Tonight, by the dim glow of this imagined fire, we retrace the rise of this entity, the world's first megacorporation, the original architect of systemic risk, the East India Company. If you find value in journeys such as this, consider supporting the work. A gentle click to like this video, a quiet step to subscribe to the Echoes of Wealth channel, or even a small contribution helps keep these long-form explorations alive. There is a particular stillness in the final hours of the year 1600, the kind of silence that settles over a kingdom when even the drunkards have fallen into the comfort of sleep. London lies wrapped in winter fog, its narrow streets slick with frost, its chimneys coughing smoke into a sky as black as unfired ink. Somewhere beyond the reach of church bells and palace guards, in a modest hall near the River Thames, 24 merchants gather around a wooden table. Their boots are wet. Their cloaks are ordinary. Their names, at this moment, are small. Yet what they sign tonight will echo farther and louder than any decree issued by kings. A charter. A simple charter. A legal permission slip that allows a group of traders to embark on a commercial expedition to Asia. Nothing more, nothing less. There are no trumpets, no celestial omens, no crowds pressing against the windows. The only witnesses are candle flames and the quiet scratching of quill pens on parchment. And still, the air feels strangely heavy, as if history itself is leaning forward to watch. In that dim chamber, the scent of melted wax mingling with damp wool, a seed is planted. A seed that will, over the next 2.5 centuries, grow into something unrecognizable, something far beyond its creator's imagination. For what begins as a company will drift, inch by inexorable inch, into the shape of an empire. Its ledger will become a map. Its warehouses will become fortresses. Its clerks will command armies larger than those of most royal states. By the time the world realizes what it has become, it will be too late to stop. The East India Company is often described as a business. But that is a kindness, or perhaps a disguise. For no corporation before or after would possess such reach, such authority, such capacity to bend the fates of millions. It was a merchant by name, but a sovereign in its appetite. It bought tea and spices. It also bought kingdoms. It traded in cloth. It also traded in wars. Its ships were not just vessels of commerce. They were the veins through which wealth and suffering pulsed across oceans. What makes this story both astonishing and unsettling is how quietly it all began. No tyrant seized power. No army marched through the heart of Europe claiming dominion. A group of men simply agreed to share risk and profit. They pooled their silver, divided ownership into shares, and trusted that cooperation would birth prosperity. And for a time, prosperity arrived like rainfall after drought. But shared prosperity, when left unchecked, has a way of mutating into shared dominance. The joint stock structure that fueled innovation also insulated ambition. Responsibility blurred. Boundaries softened. The company expanded into the empty spaces between law and empire, claiming whatever was not explicitly forbidden. When threatened, it hired soldiers. When doubted, it bribed ministers. When resisted, it crushed kingdoms beneath the disciplined march of sepoy battalions. Its original founders would have stared in disbelief if shown what their signatures ultimately unleashed. For in the quiet hours of that winter night in 1600, none of them could foresee that their modest enterprise would one day collect taxes from tens of millions, erect colossal hedges of thorn across the Indian subcontinent, or plunge nations into war over the profits of opium. Ambition rarely reveals its final form at the beginning. It arrives disguised as opportunity, then slowly rearranges itself into power, and finally hardens into destiny. By the time its shadow touches the horizon, the world has already shifted beneath its feet. The East India Company became a lesson long before it became a legend. A lesson about how structures grow beyond their creators, how systems accumulate risks their architects never planned for, how the desire for wealth becomes indistinguishable from the desire for control, and how karma waits patiently, even centuries if it must, for the right moment to balance the scale. As we step deeper into this story together, I invite you to sit close to the fire. Listen to the crackle of wood, feel the warmth sinking into your hands, and allow your mind to drift between centuries. There are no heroes here, nor villains in the simple sense of the word. Only people, ambitious, flawed, brilliant, and blind, building something they cannot fully comprehend. This is not just the tale of a company. It is the anatomy of power, the architecture of financial destiny, the origin story of modern systemic risk. And perhaps, if you listen carefully, it is also a mirror held up to our world today. If you close your eyes and listen carefully, you can almost hear the humidity of Bengal. It has a sound, soft at first, but insistent, like warm breath against the back of your neck. It is the sound of dense air settling over the Hooghly River, the slow churn of muddy water against stone ghats, the distant murmur of merchants arguing over bales of muslin so fine they can pass through a ring. Bengal, in the mid-18th century, is not a frontier. It is a jewel, the richest province in India, perhaps in the entire world. A place where artisans coax miracles from thread, where land yields rice in such abundance that granaries overflow, where the nabob's court glitters with gold filigree and perfumed lamps. And yet, just beyond this beauty, something darker is taking shape. Fort William stands like a stubborn scar on the river's edge. A British trading post, fortified with thick walls and guarded with a confidence that borders on arrogance. Inside its stone chambers, company officials sip Madeira wine, shuffle ledgers heavy with profits, and speak in clipped tones about the future of their influence in Bengal. They feel secure. They feel entitled. And that is the beginning of their blindness. For while company officers angle for advantage, a young ruler watches them with growing irritation. Siraj-ud-Dowlah, the last independent Nawab of Bengal, a man often described in British records with cruel exaggeration, but in reality a complex figure, emotional yet perceptive, proud yet cornered by forces far larger than himself. He does not see the company as a mere trading partner. He sees an intruder, a foreign body swelling in his domain, building fortifications without permission, harboring fugitives, and evading duties with a sly confidence that feels less like business and more like occupation. In the spring of 1756, the Nawab's patience dissolves. His advisors whisper warnings. His pride smolders. He gathers an army and marches toward Calcutta. And from the moment his banners rise over the horizon, the company is caught unprepared. Their letters to London had been full of bravado. Their calculations assumed superiority. But calculations built on arrogance crumble quickly. The siege is swift. Company defenses fail. Panic spreads inside the fort. Families flee to ships anchored on the river, leaving behind soldiers, clerks, and a commander whose indecision borders on cowardice. By nightfall, Fort William falls. In the chaotic aftermath, the prisoners are herded into a small guard room, a room never meant to hold more than half a dozen men. Yet into this narrow space, 146 captives are forced at bayonet point. What happens next becomes one of the most infamous nights in colonial history. The air inside the cell is suffocating from the first moment. A single candle, guttering in the corner. Men crushed shoulder to shoulder, the heat rising in choking waves. Sweat, fear, and the stench of bodies pressed beyond all human tolerance. Outside, the guards laugh drunkenly. Inside, the prisoners beg for mercy. Some claim that they clawed at the bricks. Some say they tore off their shirts trying to fan air toward one another. Others fainted where they stood, only to remain upright, held in place by the crowd. Hours pass. The cell becomes an oven. By morning, when the heavy doors finally swing open, only 23 men remain alive. The rest lie piled on the floor, their faces contorted, their limbs tangled, their final breaths trapped somewhere in the dark recesses of that room. The Black Hole of Calcutta becomes a rallying cry for the East India Company. It becomes justification. It becomes fuel. And yet, beneath the company's published accounts, beneath the engravings circulated across Britain, beneath the horror that grips the public imagination, lies a deeper, quieter truth. This tragedy did not happen in isolation. It was not a sudden eruption of cruelty from the Nawab. It was the consequence of years of unchecked pride, exploitation, and provocation. It was the moment when a system already sick with greed finally broke open and showed its rot. History is rarely the clean division of victim and villain. It is often the messy collision of desperation, fear, and hubris. But the company, in its mastery of narrative, chooses the simplest version, a version that paints itself as the innocent party. And this version becomes the spark that lights a war. Within a year, Robert Clive will return to Bengal with vengeance simmering beneath every step. Within a year, the whole of Bengal will fall under company control. And within a few years, a famine will sweep through the land, killing millions, while company coffers grow fat, all from one night, one cell. One moment when human limits were pushed beyond what flesh and spirit can bear. And yet, there is something deeper here than a historical horror. Something that stirs beneath the surface like a warning. There are moments in history when an event becomes more than itself. It becomes a symbol, a story sharpened into a weapon. In the weeks after the Black Hole tragedy, ships carry the news across the Bay of Bengal, then across the Arabian Sea, then up the Red Sea toward Europe. The tale grows darker with every retelling. Numbers inflate. Details warp. The suffering becomes spectacle. And in Britain's drawing rooms, where tea steams gently in porcelain cups and newspapers are read beside crackling hearths, the East India Company begins shaping the narrative to its advantage. People who had never heard of Calcutta now speak of it with outrage. Members of Parliament denounce the Nawab as a butcher. Investors whisper that their holdings are threatened. The company, previously criticized for its corruption and reckless expansion, suddenly reappears in the public eye as a wronged institution seeking justice. A single night, however tragic, becomes the cloak beneath which a corporate empire conceals its years of provocation. Somewhere in London, as the printing presses spit out sensational accounts, a man named Robert Clive reads these reports with cold intensity. Clive is not like the soft-handed directors of the company's court of proprietors. He is a creature forged in chaos, a man who once attempted to take his own life in despair, only to misfire twice. A man who returned to India again and again, as if the subcontinent held not merely opportunity, but the source of his identity. He is brilliant, ruthless, and uncomfortably aware that history favors the bold. The black hole gives him exactly what he needs: moral permission. And so Clive begins assembling a force. Not a grand army of a sovereign kingdom, but something stranger, something unprecedented. An army paid for by shareholders, commanded not by monarchs, but by men who read balance sheets. Yet this force carries muskets, cannons, and the silent certainty of British discipline. A hybrid creature, half corporation and half nation, marching toward Bengal with the confidence of destiny at its back. When Clive arrives at the mouth of the Hooghly River, he walks the scorched grounds of Fort William. He looks upon the black hole cell. He listens to survivors recount their night of terror. And yet, observers note that Clive does not linger in grief. His eyes drift instead to the river, to the trade routes, to the warehouses that could be rebuilt into something more than a factory, something like a throne. In private letters, he expresses outrage. In public speeches, he speaks of justice for the dead. But those who watch him closely understand something unspoken. Clive does not mourn tragedy. He weaponizes it. The Nawab, Siraj-ud-Dawla, is meanwhile confronted by a different atmosphere. In his palace at Murshidabad, surrounded by courtiers who fear him, yet secretly doubt him, he senses that the winds have shifted. The fall of Calcutta was supposed to be a warning to the company, a way to reclaim sovereignty. Yet now he hears rumors of British troops landing with unprecedented force. Letters arrive from advisors urging diplomacy. Others caution him to prepare for war. And somewhere in the court's endless corridors, conspirators whisper in alcoves, plotting their own futures. Siraj is young, barely in his 20s, caught between the grandeur of his inheritance and the fragility of his authority. His temperament is volatile, but so is the world around him. The company's appetite grows even as his own allies shrink away. Meanwhile, in the villages surrounding Calcutta, ordinary people feel tremors of change without understanding their source. Merchants raise their prices. Boatmen whisper about foreign soldiers arriving on the river. Artisans worry about lost orders. Farmers hear rumors of guns and banners and begin to sense that something vast is approaching their quiet lives. History often arrives like this, not as a thunderclap, but as a slow tightening in the air. As Clive prepares for confrontation, the company's directors celebrate the rising tide of support in Britain. They have turned a tragedy into legitimacy. They have turned loss into opportunity. And in doing so, they take their first steps down a path that will eventually place all of Bengal under their control. But beneath the political maneuvering and military preparations lies an invisible principle at work. A principle as old as human ambition. Whenever greed blinds an institution to its own excesses, the world eventually corrects it. Sometimes gently, sometimes brutally. And when the correction is ignored, when every sign is dismissed as irrelevant, the cost multiplies. The black hole was not merely an event. It was a signal. A warning that something within the system had warped. A moment when equilibrium demanded restoration. Yet instead of humility, the company responded with conquest. A choice that would reshape India. A choice that would reshape Britain. A choice that would reshape the global economy in ways still felt today. When Robert Clive finally marches his forces into Bengal's interior, the landscape stretches before him like a quiet illusion. Wide fields of ripening rice shimmer beneath the sun. Palm trees flicker in the warm wind. Villages sleep in the soft haze of morning, their thatched roofs glowing gold. It is a land so generous, so wealthy, so overflowing with resources that travelers from Europe often describe it as paradise. Yet beneath this peaceful surface, tension coils like a serpent waiting to strike. Clive moves with a confidence that borders on prophetic certainty. His letters from this period reveal a man convinced that destiny favors him. He writes of a design unfolding, as though the universe itself has chosen him to correct the balance that the black hole tragedy disrupted. But this conviction is not mystical. It is strategic. Clive understands that power is seized not only with muskets, but with stories, alliances, and the precise application of fear. One of the most potent weapons in his arsenal is a name whispered constantly in Bengal's court: Mir Jafar, a commander in Siraj-ud-Dowlah's army, a man overlooked, resentful, and ambitious. Clive meets secretly with Mir Jafar's representatives, offering wealth, land, and the promise of power in exchange for betrayal at the critical moment. The negotiation unfolds in shadows, over coded letters and hushed conversations. In one account, Mir Jafar reportedly paced for nights, torn between loyalty and opportunity, though his decision was already leaning toward the latter. Betrayal often begins long before the final act. The Nawab, meanwhile, senses treachery but cannot pinpoint its source. His court is a labyrinth of rival factions, each whispering in his ear. Some urge him to negotiate with the British. Others advise preparing for war. A few secretly pledge loyalty to his enemies. Siraj walks the marble halls of Murshidabad restless, unable to trust the very people sworn to protect him. He is young, inexperienced, and suddenly alone in a palace full of masks. As Clive's forces advance, the Nawab realizes that the confrontation is inevitable. He gathers his army, tens of thousands strong, and marches toward the plains near Plassey. It is a place of mango groves and soft earth, a place that will become one of the most decisive battlefields in world history. But before armies clash, something else unfolds. Something less visible, but far more telling. Clive, in the nights leading up to the battle, is reported to have walked alone beneath the trees, wrestling with doubt. He faces an enemy far larger in number, in resources, in local support. He writes to a colleague that he is unsure whether to advance or withdraw. One version of the story says he convened a council of war, where his officers voted against attacking. And then, after hearing their fears and concerns, Clive stepped outside, stood beneath a sky trembling with monsoon clouds, and made the decision alone. He would fight. But why? What gave him this confidence? Perhaps it was the secret pact with Mir Jafar. Perhaps it was his own belief in destiny. Or perhaps it was the cold realism that weakness is more fatal than risk. History often remembers the bold, not the prudent. At dawn, on the 23rd of June, the field of Plassey awakens under a sky swollen with incoming rain. The Nawab's forces stretch in a vast crescent. Elephants draped in embroidered cloth sway restlessly. Cannons gleam. Soldiers in bright uniforms chant prayers. Their numbers seem endless, a tidal wave of men prepared to defend their sovereignty. Clive's army, by contrast, is small enough to count without trouble. A few thousand soldiers, a handful of artillery pieces, a force that should, by all reasonable calculation, be swallowed whole. But calculations built on appearances rarely reveal the truth. For as thunder rolls across the plains and the first shots crack through the humid air, it becomes clear that the battle is not between two armies. It is between conviction and doubt, between loyalty and betrayal, between a ruler whose supporters have already abandoned him, and a commander whose alliances have been forged with silver and promises. As the fighting intensifies, the Nawab looks to Mir Jafar, expecting support, reinforcement, courage. But Mir Jafar's troops remain still. His banners do not advance. His soldiers watch like spectators at a performance whose ending they already know. It is said that Siraj's heart sank in that moment, the realization striking him that the battle was lost not on the field, but in the shadows long before dawn. The skies break open. Rain pours down in torrents. The Nawab's cannons, heavy and reliant on dry powder, falter in the mud. Clive's lighter artillery continues firing. Confusion ripples through the Nawab's ranks. Soldiers begin to retreat. Commands dissolve into chaos. And within hours, the mighty army of Bengal collapses. The Battle of Plassey lasts less than a day, yet its consequences last centuries. Clive walks through the aftermath with an expression that witnesses describe as calm, almost detached. The rain has washed the blood into the earth. The mango trees drip quietly. The fate of Bengal, and by extension the fate of India, has been rewritten so swiftly that the land itself seems stunned. Siraj-ud-Dowlah flees. Within days, he is captured. There are conflicting accounts of his final hours, but most agree that he died terrified and alone, betrayed by those he once trusted. His body, once draped in royal silk, is left in mud. A tragic end for the last independent Nawab of Bengal. And thus, from the Black Hole tragedy to the fields of Plassey, a single chain of events takes shape. Greed, miscalculation, outrage, manipulation, betrayal, conquest. A company has defeated a kingdom. A corporation has taken control of one of the wealthiest regions on Earth. This is not simply a shift of power. It is the birth of a new kind of power, something the world has never seen before. After the thunder of Plassey fades, the land falls into a strange and uneasy quiet. The mango groves stand untouched, their branches dripping with rain, as if unaware that the fate of an entire subcontinent has just been rewritten beneath them. Robert Clive sits in a tent lit by oil lamps, the canvas walls fluttering softly, and begins drafting the new shape of Bengal. His ink blotches settle into the parchment like seeds of a future that no one in the company's London boardrooms can yet imagine. Mir Jafar, now elevated as the new Nawab, enters his role with the trembling unease of a man who has gained everything yet lost his soul. He walks through Murshidabad's corridors with gold-threaded robes, but his face betrays the truth. His kingdom belongs not to him, but to the men who engineered his ascent. The company expects repayment, not just gratitude, but wealth, rivers of wealth. And so the extraction begins. Clive demands massive payments immediately. Compensation for the costs of war, restitution for the Black Hole tragedy, rewards for company officers, gifts for allies. The numbers are staggering. Chests of gold, jewels, precious fabrics, and meticulously weighed silver coins begin moving out of the Nawab's treasury. An eyewitness account describes the procession as a river of treasure flowing into British hands. Another observer notes that Clive himself accepted gifts so vast that even London was shocked. He received jagirs, land revenues, and priceless jewels. One famous piece, the diamond he took from Mir Jafar, sometimes referred to as the Great Mogul's diamond, sparked envy across Europe. But all wealth has a scent, and this wealth carries the sharp aroma of imbalance. From the very moment the company assumes control of Bengal's finances, its officers discover something intoxicating: revenue. Not the modest profits of pepper or calico, but the taxes of a province, the income of millions of people. In a single stroke, the company transforms from a trading entity to a ruling authority. And with this transformation comes a new system, one built with cold precision rather than local understanding. Company administrators, eager to prove efficiency to shareholders, raise taxes. They restructure land revenue. They enforce strict collection targets. They replace experienced Indian officials with inexperienced English clerks who barely understand the languages or customs of the people they govern. These new administrators view Bengal not as a living society, but as a ledger, a vast numerical field to be optimized. In villages from Patna to Dhaka, the effects are immediate. Peasants accustomed to negotiated tax cycles now face inflexible demands. Weavers who once worked under the nurturing patronage of local guilds find themselves forced into contracts with fixed prices set by the company. Some are beaten for refusing. Others have their looms seized when they cannot meet quotas. The famed muslin of Bengal, once the pride of the world, begins its gradual decline. There are stories whispered among old families, passed down through generations, of weavers whose thumbs were cut to prevent them from producing cloth outside company control. The veracity of these tales is debated, yet their persistence reveals the emotional truth. Bengal's artisans felt their world tightening like a noose. Clive's personal fortunes grow astronomically. His estate in England expands. He buys mansions. He sits in Parliament. The British public, dazzled by his newfound wealth, first celebrates him as a hero. But doubts soon creep in. How can one man accumulate such riches so quickly? What moral lines have been crossed? Yet Clive remains untroubled. He writes confidently about his achievements, proud of how he restored order to Bengal. But history, and even some of his contemporaries, see a deeper pattern forming, a shift from commerce to control, from profit to plunder, from partnership to domination. Meanwhile, the people of Bengal begin to notice changes in the landscape itself. The old harmony between landowners, farmers, and artisans begins to fracture. Markets become unpredictable. Food prices rise. Granaries, once full, show signs of strain. Rivers, choked by mismanagement. Flood fields that were previously fertile. Something subtle but dangerous is unfolding. A thread is being pulled, and the fabric of Bengal's prosperity begins to fray. In the years following Plassey, observers write of a growing sense of dread. The company's extraction is relentless, its policies rigid, its priorities aligned not with the welfare of Bengal, but with the dividends of distant shareholders. The company is now more powerful than ever. But power built on exploitation carries an invisible weakness. It creates imbalances that cannot be sustained. And the consequences of those imbalances, once set in motion, follow their own dark logic. The black hole tragedy, which the company used as moral justification, becomes a faint shadow compared to the suffering now unfolding across the province. Yet the company does not pause, does not reflect, does not question its path. What began as vengeance has become a machine that consumes more than it understands. In London, Shareholders celebrate rising profits. In Bengal, famine seeds itself quietly in the soil. The story is not yet finished. Another disaster will soon reveal what happens when greed outpaces wisdom. The monsoon rains had barely ended when Bengal's fields returned to their gentle shimmer, but the land beneath that beauty had shifted forever. The East India Company now stood not as a merchant, not even as a foreign overseer, but as something else entirely. Its victory at Plassey ignited the first transformation. What followed, over the next decade, was a metamorphosis so extraordinary that even the company's oldest directors struggled to comprehend it. A business had begun to acquire the anatomy of a state. Yet this transformation did not begin on battlegrounds. It began in the barracks. To understand the next chapter of this unfolding empire, one must walk into a sepoy cantonment during the waning years of the 18th century. Imagine the early morning light spreading across long rows of thatched huts, smoke rising from cooking fires, the clatter of metal bowls as soldiers eat their ration of lentils and flatbread. These men, the sepoys, are not British. They are Indian recruits, drawn from diverse castes and regions, trained with European discipline and drilled to march in perfect lines. Their uniforms are simple, but their muskets gleam with meticulous care. Each morning begins the same way, with the rhythmic pounding of feet on packed earth, the shouted commands of British officers, and the relentless repetition of formations until every man moves like a gear in a vast machine. This is the company's secret. Its weapon more powerful than artillery or ship cannons. A private army, professional, organized, loyal not to a king, but to a corporation. By the early 1800s, the company commands more soldiers in India than the British Crown itself. A staggering force of over 260,000 men. If the company were a nation, this army would rank among the world's most formidable. If it were a man, its shadow would stretch across continents. And yet, this extraordinary force grows quietly, almost invisibly, like roots spreading underground. There are diaries written by junior officers stationed in Bihar and Oudh describing the strange duality of their service. On paper, they are employees, not servants of a monarch. Their salaries are paid by shareholders. Their promotions decided not by aristocratic birthright, but by battlefield effectiveness and political usefulness. Some officers write of feeling unmoored, as though they are members of a state without a flag. One lieutenant describes the company army as a kingdom built of ledgers, its loyalty bound to profit rather than patriotism. Meanwhile, the sepoys themselves form a society within a society. Their days are filled with drills, prayer rituals, inspections, and long conversations under the sheltering trees near their barracks. They come from families who see military service as honorable. Many believe the company will bring order, justice, and the possibility of advancement. For some, the regular pay and the structured life offer dignity that village life could not. But beneath the harmony of drum beats and drills lies something darker. To maintain control over such an enormous force, the company imposes strict discipline. Punishments are swift. Desertion is met with brutal reprisals. New recruits are subjected to intense pressure to absorb British military customs while still maintaining their religious identity, a delicate balance that will, in the future, rupture with catastrophic consequences. For now, the machine holds, and it expands. The company's directors watch this growth with fascination. They began as merchants trading spices, cotton, tea, and opium. Now they command the largest private army in the world. Their ships control the Indian Ocean. Their officers oversee territories larger than most European kingdoms. Their influence stretches from the Arabian Sea to the Bay of Bengal, from the Himalayas down to the lush plains of the south. But the directors are not warriors. Many have never held a musket. Some have never even left London. Yet through a structure of paperwork, salaries, promotions, and contracts, they command soldiers who fight, bleed, and die thousands of miles away. There is a letter written by a company officer named Alexander Dow, preserved in a faded archive, in which he describes a peculiar moment during his service. He writes of standing on a hill overlooking a battlefield and realizing, with sudden clarity, that the men dying below him were not fighting for a crown or a homeland. They were fighting for quarterly profits, dividends, and the ambitions of directors who would never see a battlefield. "It is a strange thing," he writes, "to wield the sword for men who wield only the pen." And yet the machine grows. The company's territories expand through treaties, purchases, threats, and, when necessary, force. It takes over administrative duties, tax collection, legal courts, and trade networks. Governors and magistrates are appointed. Engineers build roads and forts. Diplomats negotiate with princes. Cartographers map vast stretches of land. Clerks record every rupee that enters the company coffers. This is not merely a corporation anymore. It is the skeleton of a nation. But every structure carries within it an invisible tension. Every expansion plants the seeds of its own future strain. Behind the glittering veneer of the company's military might, the signs are already emerging. Letters from sepoy units mention growing grievances about pay disputes, caste disputes, religious concerns, and lack of respect from British officers. Reports from magistrates speak of villagers resenting the heavy tax burdens imposed to sustain the ever-growing army. Merchants complain that the company's monopolies choke local industries. The machine grows stronger, but also heavier. And somewhere deep within its gears, the first hints of friction begin to hum. The deeper one looks into the company's growing apparatus, the more surreal its transformation becomes. What began as a network of warehouses and merchants now resembles a sprawling organism with nerves, arteries, and a fiercely beating heart. That heart is the army, but its veins spread into every corner of India's political landscape. And in those veins flows something more potent than blood. It is ambition, carried in dispatches, salaries, promotions, and the cold arithmetic of conquest. To understand the next stage of this metamorphosis, imagine standing at the edge of a cantonment in Oud during the first years of the 19th century. The sun has barely risen, yet the camp already hums with movement. Rows of sepoys polish muskets with reverence. Cavalry units groom their horses with a tenderness entirely absent from the battlefield. British officers, many of them in their 20s, stroll through the camp with an air of inherited authority. Some wear crisp uniforms tailored in London. Others wear loose cotton garments adapted to the sweltering Indian heat. A few have adopted local habits, drinking sweetened milk tea at dawn, smoking hookah pipes under neem trees, or learning enough Persian and Hindustani to bark commands without translators. This mingling of worlds gives rise to an intricate culture, one in which British discipline and Indian spirit coexist uneasily. Officers rely on sepoys for survival. Sepoys rely on officers for structure. Mutual respect flickers in some regiments. Condescension poisons others. But together, they form the backbone of a force whose power is unknown outside the company's dominions. As the army grows, so does the company's bureaucracy. In Calcutta, the seat of company governance, clerks pore over mountains of paperwork. Reports from battlefield officers, tax collectors, magistrates, engineers, diplomats, and spies flow into the writer's building like torrents into a reservoir. These reports are copied, summarized, analyzed, and shipped to London in thick packet fleets. The company's governance system becomes so elaborate that foreign visitors describe it with awe and confusion. It is a world where a minor decision in a distant village can ripple through ledgers, letters, and committees until it reaches a polished table in the India House of London. Those polished tables witness conversations that shape nations. Consider a scene in one of the company's London boardrooms around 1805. Oil lamps flicker against dark-paneled walls. The directors sit in heavy chairs, their wigs powdered, their voices hushed but firm. On the table lie neatly stacked reports from India. They read of revenue increases from Bengal, new treaties in the Deccan, the subdued ambitions of Mysore after Tipu Sultan's fall, the continued loyalty of key sepoy regiments, and the promising results of infrastructure projects financed by Indian taxes. Yet none of these men have ever seen Bengal's monsoons or walked through the ruins of Seringapatam. They order roads to be built without having sweated under the Indian sun. They raise taxes without ever touching the soil from which those taxes are extracted. They command armies without hearing the drumbeat of sepoy battalions. Power, in this era, becomes strangely abstracted, distant, mathematical. And this abstraction is precisely what fuels the company's explosive expansion. Because where kingdoms hesitate, corporations calculate. Where monarchs deliberate, boards decide. Where empires fear risk, shareholders embrace it, so long as dividends continue to rise. This rational, profit-seeking logic gives birth to a new strategy: annexation through debt and diplomacy. First comes the political agent, usually a young British officer with impeccable manners and a sharp understanding of pressure. He approaches Indian rulers with offers of protection and military support, protection against rivals, protection against rebellions, protection against imaginary threats. The price is a subsidiary alliance, a treaty requiring the ruler to maintain a permanent British force in his territory, paid for by his own revenues. The genius of this arrangement is that it appears voluntary. The company does not march in demanding land. It waits until the ruler cannot pay the costs of his own protection. And then, with a sigh of regret, The company offers a solution: cede territory instead. Thus, without firing a shot, entire provinces slide into company control. Scholars today still marvel at the psychological precision of these tactics. A careful blend of coercion, diplomacy, and financial engineering. One historian famously described it as conquest by ledger rather than by lance. But conquest, no matter how elegantly masked, accumulates consequences. In the princely courts, Indian rulers grow increasingly anxious. Some attempt reforms. Others sink into decadence. A few plot rebellions and alliances, hoping to push back against the company's encroaching grip. Local nobles, zamindars, and merchant guilds, once powerful pillars of Indian society, find themselves slowly sidelined. Their influence dissolves as company administrators take control of trade routes, legal systems, and tax structures. Letters from Indian nobles during this period reveal a deep sense of disorientation. They write of a world in which customs older than dynasties suddenly become irrelevant. They speak of foreign officers who do not understand the subtleties of caste, religious law, or local traditions. They describe courts that once pulsed with poetry, music, and political debate now reduced to echo chambers of anxiety and diminishing authority. Meanwhile, the sepoys march forward, building the company's empire one outpost at a time. And yet, within the ranks of those soldiers, another kind of unease begins to spread. It is quiet at first, a question asked in the dark, a rumor whispered over a cook fire, a sense that the company's officers, especially the younger ones newly arrived from Europe, possess a growing arrogance. Some sepoys notice that their pay does not rise in proportion to the company's wealth. Others resent punishments that seem disproportionate. A few become disturbed by the creeping suspicion that the company's policies may someday threaten their religious practices. These are not yet cracks, but they are stress lines. And stress lines, left unattended, become fractures. Still, the machine grows. It conquers. It consumes. It becomes a nation in all but name. To understand the full magnitude of what the company was becoming, one must leave the barracks and boardrooms and step inside the quiet chambers where the real architecture of empire was being drafted. These rooms were not grand. They lacked the gold leaf ceilings of European palaces or the marble opulence of Indian courts. They were simple, almost austere, their walls lined with maps, their tables littered with ink-stained documents. But inside them, something extraordinary was taking shape. The blueprint of a corporate state. Picture a senior company officer in one of these rooms, perhaps in Fort William, perhaps in Madras, perhaps in a regional residency carved out of a once royal palace. He bends over a map, tracing the contours of rivers and roads with a worn fingertip. Beside him, clerks read revenue figures aloud. A translator stands by with court records written in Persian. A military officer discusses the location of outposts and the reliability of certain sepoy regiments. Documents arrive hourly. Reports on harvest yields, intelligence from spies, letters from merchants, complaints from zamindars, and updates from the Judicial Committee in Calcutta. In these rooms, decisions are made that alter the lives of millions. And yet, to the men making them, These decisions feel administrative, procedural, even mundane. They are simply doing their jobs, maximizing efficiency, ensuring stability, extracting revenue. But empire has always been built by men who believed they were merely fulfilling their roles. The company formalizes its control through three pillars: military force, administrative regulation, and financial domination. The military is the spine. The administration is the nervous system. The finance is the lifeblood. Together, they animate a creature unprecedented in world history. One of the most striking manifestations of this creature is the company's judicial system. Before its rule, Indian courts operated on a complex interplay of local customs, religious laws, and princely authority. But the company, in pursuit of greater order, begins codifying laws, creating standardized courts, and appointing judges who often have little understanding of the cultures they are meant to interpret. English legal thought, rooted in individual property rights and contract doctrine, collides with centuries-old Indian traditions. Some cases bewilder the judges. Others anger local communities. But the machinery moves forward, grinding old structures into new shapes. The company's bureaucracy becomes so intricate that it generates its own mythology. In coffee houses across Calcutta, young clerks boast of handling cases involving entire districts. In London, retired company men speak with pride about shaping policies for provinces larger than European nations. Some years later, when scholars examine the company's papers, they will remark on their astonishing volume. Millions of pages, documenting everything from palace politics to the price of salt in obscure villages. A corporate memory so vast that even the company itself often struggled to navigate it. Meanwhile, the army continues to expand. New regiments are raised. Old ones are reorganized. British officers are trained in Sandhurst with the explicit expectation that they will someday command Indian troops. Sepoys are drilled with increasing intensity. The company experiments with new weapons, new formations, and new strategies. Military engineers carve roads through jungles and deserts, connecting newly conquered lands with trade routes that feed directly into the company's treasury. Yet expansion always brings tension. A peculiar imbalance begins to trouble the officers who understand the deeper currents of power. The company's territory grows faster than its ability to govern it. To compensate, the company adopts policies that inadvertently create new conflicts. In some regions, they impose land settlements that overtax farmers. In others, they enforce salt monopolies, driving up prices on an essential commodity. They ban certain local practices, unintentionally offending religious groups. They elevate new elites, angering older ones. Villagers who once owed allegiance to local princes now find themselves governed by foreign administrators who neither speak their language nor understand their customs. Still, the company insists it is bringing order, bringing reason, bringing progress. But order without empathy fractures. Reason without context blinds. Progress without humility corrupts. The sepoys feel these fractures first. Letters from sepoy families reveal quiet unrest, complaints about delays in pay, rumors that certain officers mock their religious rituals, concerns that new uniforms or weapon cartridges may violate caste restrictions. These concerns seem small when taken individually, but no army collapses from a single grievance. Armies collapse from the accumulation of tiny insults, each one dismissed by superiors until the final insult breaks the unspoken contract. And yet, as these tensions simmer, the company reaches the height of its power. By the 1830s, it controls vast stretches of the Indian subcontinent. It collects taxes from tens of millions. Its trade routes dominate the Indian Ocean. Its armies rival the greatest powers of Europe. Its influence stretches from Singapore to Kabul. Newspapers in London speak of the company with awe, suspicion, and uneasy admiration. Some call it a nation within a nation. Others call it the Leviathan of the East. A few speak the uncomfortable truth that the company has become so big that even Britain itself struggles to restrain it. Financially, the company appears unstoppable, but beneath the surface, something fragile begins to form. A kind of systemic imbalance that no one has yet named. An empire too powerful to challenge, yet too unstable to survive unchanged. A corporate organism whose growth carries the seeds of its eventual collapse. For now, though, the company still stands triumphant, a creature of dazzling power, commanding armies and territories with a scale that defies comprehension. But every triumph deepens the shadow. Every expansion strains the structure. And somewhere in the unseen future, the consequences gather like storm clouds. There are certain moments in world history when a single substance holds the fate of nations in its palm. Gold has done it. Salt has done it. Oil still does. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, it was a pale, powdery resin, bitter, pungent, and deceptively simple, that bent the will of emperors and hollowed the integrity of a rising global power. Opium, to understand how a corporation ignited wars, destabilized kingdoms, and cracked open the gates of the ancient Chinese Empire, we must begin not with conflict, but with desire. A slow-burning desire, carried across oceans in the hulls of ships, stored in bamboo chests, and traded in dimly lit coastal warehouses where fortunes changed hands in silence. Imagine a humid night in Patna, one of the major opium-producing centers of the East India Company. The year is somewhere in the early 1800s. The moon hangs low over the Ganges. Rows upon rows of poppies sway gently in the warm breeze, their pale petals glowing faintly. Workers move through the fields with practiced precision, scoring each bulb to collect the sticky resin that oozes like a dark tear. The substance is scraped, dried, packed, sealed in crates, inspected by company agents, then locked under guard. It is not simply a commodity. It is the company's golden artery. For by this time, the company has discovered a problem that threatens its entire economic structure. China, with its ancient dynasties, its complex bureaucracy, its porcelain, its silk, and most importantly, its tea. The British public has developed an insatiable appetite for tea. Tea has woven itself into the rhythms of daily life. Morning tea, afternoon tea, tea at social gatherings, tea in Parliament, tea in the kitchen of a coal miner. But the Chinese Empire does not want British goods in exchange. It demands silver, and silver, precious and finite, drains from Britain in rivers. This imbalance terrifies company economists. Reports flood into London. Silver reserves fall to dangerous levels. Alarm grows. Men in powdered wigs debate anxiously beneath the ornate ceilings of Parliament. If the flow of silver continues, the British economy itself may falter. And then someone in the company's labyrinthine decision rooms sees the answer. Sell China something it cannot refuse. Not pottery, not textiles. Something that reroutes the silver back into British hands. Opium. A loophole appears. The Qianlong Emperor bans the importation of opium. But the ban is only on legal trade. The company, with a slyness that history will never forget, discovers that it can cultivate opium in India, auction it off to private merchants, pretend to step aside, and allow these merchants to smuggle it into Chinese ports. Beijing cannot accuse the company directly because, on paper, the company is not smuggling anything. It is selling opium domestically in India. Meanwhile, the smugglers, many of whom operate with subtle company protection, flood the Chinese coast with the drug. There is a haunting letter written by a Chinese official during this period. He describes seeing teenage boys in Guangdong stumbling along alleyways, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. He writes of merchants bribing customs officers, of secret opium dens spreading like a stain through cities, of once thriving communities slowly unraveling under addiction. His words tremble with despair as he pleads, "We cannot allow this poison to hollow out the bones of the empire." But the poison keeps flowing. Company ships unload more chests each year. The numbers swell from a few thousand chests annually to tens of thousands. Each chest worth a fortune. Each sale tightening the company's grip on the global silver supply. The opium trade becomes the company's beating financial heart, funding armies, administration, infrastructure, and the lifestyles of officers and shareholders. Back in India, farmers are forced to grow poppies under strict company contracts. If they refuse, they face fines, imprisonment, or the destruction of their fields. Some villages suffer famine as food crops are displaced. Others watch their sons flee to avoid the contracts. Letters from regional magistrates reveal the same pattern repeated across Bihar, Bengal, and the northwestern provinces. Fields of food shrinking. Fields of opium expanding. The true victims of the trade exist on both ends of the route. In India, poverty deepens. In China, addiction spreads. And in London, the company executives celebrate record profits. There is a chilling moment described in a diary by an anonymous company director. He writes about attending a gathering where investors raise glasses in toast to the efficiency of the China trade. There is no mention of addiction, no mention of the moral cost, only revenue reports. This moral blindness is not new in history, but what makes the company unique is the scale. It is not a rogue smuggler acting out of greed. It is a global corporate structure deploying the mechanisms of commerce to achieve what armies alone could not: the economic destabilization of a sovereign empire. By the 1830s, the situation in China becomes intolerable. The Daoguang Emperor orders Commissioner Lin Zexu to destroy the opium trade once and for all. Lin, a scholar and a man of stern moral conviction, writes a letter to Queen Victoria questioning how a nation that bans opium at home can justify poisoning another. The letter never reaches her. But his resolve remains. He confiscates over 20,000 chests of opium and destroys them publicly. This act becomes the spark. A single spark that ignites the opium wars. A war not between nations, but between a moral empire and a corporate empire. And perhaps the most haunting truth in this chapter is that Britain, the sovereign state, joins the company's fight, not out of principle, but out of economic dependence. When a corporation becomes powerful enough, a nation follows its shadow. To understand the eruption that followed Commissioner Lin's bold defiance, we must imagine the atmosphere of coastal China in the spring of 1839. The warm sea air drifts over the warehouses of Canton, carrying the scent of brine, tea leaves, and the faint, sickly sweetness of opium smoke lingering in the alleys. Sampans drift lazily in the Pearl River's current. Merchants bargain in a dozen dialects. Shutters creak open at sunrise. On the surface, the city seems peaceful. But peace can be a thin veneer stretched over a furnace. And Lin Zexu is the flame that begins to burn through it. Lin arrives in Guangdong with a reputation of incorruptible severity. His previous posts earned him admiration and fear in equal measure. He is a man who quotes Confucius with the same conviction that he enforces imperial law. A man whose moral clarity is so intense that it feels almost like a physical force. There are accounts from local officials describing how his presence alone seemed to tighten the air. Merchants who once smirked at regulations now bow their heads. Families who quietly tolerated opium dens watch with new hope as Lin cracks down on dealers. Under his orders, thousands of pipes are smashed, dens are raided, addicts are forced into rehabilitation centers, and corrupt officials are dismissed without mercy. But the centerpiece of Lin's crusade, the act that will be remembered for centuries, is the confiscation and destruction of opium. In a series of decisive moves, Lin surrounds the foreign factories in Canton, forcing British merchants into confinement until they surrender their opium stockpiles. Many hesitate, fearful of their investors. Some attempt secret deals. But Lin remains immovable, a granite pillar standing against the tide of corruption. Eventually, under pressure, the merchants capitulate. Over 20,000 chests, each chest containing roughly 100 pounds of opium, are handed over to Chinese authorities. The sheer volume is staggering. Enough to intoxicate millions. Enough to bankrupt smugglers. Enough to enrage the East India Company. Lin orders the opium to be destroyed publicly. Witnesses describe a surreal scene. Giant trenches dug near the shore. Workers mixing the opium with lime and salt water. The thick, black paste dissolving into the sand. The air heavy with the scent of raw narcotic. Chinese soldiers standing guard, their armor gleaming under the sun. Crowds watching silently as the poison that flooded their streets drains away into the earth. This single act, firm, righteous, and uncompromising, reverberates across the world. In India, company agents are stunned. The opium revenue supports their massive armies, administrative apparatus, and dividends. Without this stream, the entire structure begins to wobble. Reports from Patna and Benares mention panic among merchants who had grown wealthy from the trade. Some beg the company for protection. Others storm warehouses demanding compensation. A few quietly flee, fearing retribution from both sides. In London, the reaction is incendiary. The destruction of opium is framed not as a moral necessity, but as an attack on British property. Parliament debates the crisis with heated voices echoing against marble walls. Some politicians argue that the Chinese have every right to resist the poisoning of their people. But their voices are drowned out by the thunderous outrage of merchants, shareholders, company lobbyists, and politicians with ties to the lucrative Asian trade. They argue not about ethics, but about honor, commerce, and British rights abroad. Words that hide the truth. The empire wants its profits back. Newspapers fan the flames. They publish illustrations of British merchants humiliated by barbaric Chinese officials. They print sensational stories of tyranny, conveniently omitting the company's role in fostering addiction. Public opinion shifts. The outrage becomes patriotic fuel. Soon, British warships are dispatched to China, and so begins the First Opium War. Imagine the sight of those ships as they appear off the Chinese coast. Iron-gray hulls slicing through the pearl-colored waves, cannons gleaming, smoke rising from their stacks. They are not merely vessels of war. They are the embodied will of the British Empire, moved into action by a corporation's financial interests. The war that follows is brutal and shockingly one-sided. British naval artillery devastates Chinese fortifications. Troops land with disciplined precision. Negotiations fail as soon as they begin, for Britain has already decided the outcome. In city after city, the Qing dynasty's defenses collapse. Their tactics, their weapons, their command structures, all remnants of an older world, prove no match for the industrial power of a nation propelled by commerce. In the midst of this chaos, Lin Zexu is dismissed from his position, not for failure, but for moral righteousness. His stand, noble as it was, becomes politically inconvenient. He is sent into exile in Xinjiang. There are heartbreaking accounts of his final days before departure. His friends weep. His supporters gather quietly outside his residence. Yet Lin remains composed. He writes poetry about the vastness of China, the weight of duty, and the sorrow of watching his nation bow to foreign force. Meanwhile, the war marches forward. When the dust finally settles, the Treaty of Nanking is signed in 1842. It is a document soaked not in ink, but in humiliation. China is forced to open ports, pay massive reparations, and cede Hong Kong. British merchants celebrate. Company shareholders rejoice. War has restored their profits. War has reopened the opium floodgates. But beneath this victory lies a terrible irony. The war did not strengthen the British Empire. It corrupted it. The moral decay spreads not in China, but in London. A great empire has just fought a war on behalf of narcotics. A sovereign nation has enforced the commercial ambition of a corporation. A global power has chosen profit over principle. And in doing so, the British Empire has set something in motion that will return to haunt it. When the smoke of the First Opium War finally drifts out toward the open sea, it leaves behind a China irrevocably wounded and a Britain outwardly victorious. But victory built on corruption carries its own gravity, its own decay, its own quiet unraveling. And at the center of that unraveling stands the East India Company, now more powerful than ever, yet more perilously entangled in consequences it cannot control. In the years following the Treaty of Nanking, the company's opium trade surges to unprecedented levels. Ships travel back and forth across the Bay of Bengal like shuttles weaving a dark tapestry. Company auctions in Calcutta and Patna swell with merchants bidding frantically for their share of the lucrative traffic. Newspaper reports describe the record revenues with a tone bordering on gleeful admiration. Investors celebrate dividends that seem almost unnatural in scale. The company's directors, seated comfortably in London's India House, view the surge as proof of the empire's wisdom. But beneath this surface triumph, the company has unleashed a force it cannot reverse. China, humiliated and fractured, becomes increasingly vulnerable to internal turmoil. Provinces rebel. Secret societies flourish. Corruption proliferates in every layer of administration. And addiction spreads like a slow, burning fire. In some regions, 1 out of every 10 adult males becomes dependent. Villages lose their labor force. Families collapse under the weight of disease and poverty. Imperial officials, desperate to reassert control, issue edicts condemning opium with increasing ferocity. But their words carry little power. Sovereignty itself has been compromised by the concessions forced upon them. The poison that weakened China's body now begins to seep into its bones. Some Chinese scholars of the time write that the empire's mandate of heaven visibly darkened in these years. Confucian ideals eroded. Court rituals hollowed out. The emperor's authority, once as solid as the Great Wall, became brittle, cracked by foreign pressure and internal decay. But the most astonishing irony lies not in China's suffering, but in England's response. Rather than reflect on the moral catastrophe they helped engineer, British newspapers celebrate the opening of China as an inevitable triumph of progress. They print caricatures of Chinese officials, mocking their stubborn resistance to free trade. They hold banquets in London where toasts are raised to the prosperity of the Oriental market. Politicians congratulate themselves. Company executives expand their homes, their estates, their influence in Parliament. A corporation has shaped the foreign policy of a global empire, and the empire has followed willingly. But a system built on moral distortion inevitably attracts deeper distortions. By the 1850s, the opium trade becomes so catastrophically entrenched that China spirals into one of the deadliest civil conflicts in human history, the Taiping Rebellion. Tens of millions die. Provinces burn. Armies clash across vast landscapes. And yet, even in the midst of China's agony, foreign traders continue unloading opium at the ports. Addiction feeds despair. Despair feeds revolt. Revolt feeds chaos. Chaos feeds demand for escape. It becomes a cycle so tragic, so brutal, that even some European observers begin to question whether the trade has gone too far. One British missionary writes in his diary, "We have opened a wound that will never close." Another, stationed in Shanghai, describes watching an opium den filled with young boys barely 13. Their eyes were empty. he writes, as if their spirits had been stolen. But the company continues. Money continues. Shareholders continue. And so Britain fights a second opium war. The pattern repeats. Warships arrive. Fortifications crumble. Treaties are signed. More ports are forced open. More rights are extracted. More humiliation is inflicted. China's resistance, though fierce, is crushed beneath industrial firepower and diplomatic manipulation. Yet even as the company secures these victories on foreign soil, a seismic shift occurs closer to home. In London, politicians and intellectuals begin to whisper what few dared to say aloud. The East India Company has become a monster, not because of its military power, though that is immense, not because of its wealth, though that is staggering, but because its interests no longer align with the interests of Britain. It has its own priorities now, its own logic, its own momentum. The British Empire is meant to serve the crown and the nation. The East India Company serves shareholders, and the divergence between these two paths becomes undeniable. Investigations begin. Committees convene. Reports are drafted detailing corruption, mismanagement, human suffering, and economic instability within company-controlled India. Even Queen Victoria's ministers begin distancing themselves from the company's actions in China, speaking of excesses and commercial extremities. Pamphlets circulate in London calling the company a plague on both continents. Meanwhile, opium revenue, once a foundation of the company's financial empire, starts showing signs of volatility. Wars are expensive. Administration is expensive. Maintaining a vast private army is expensive. And resistance within India grows more frequent. The company's reliance on opium becomes dangerous, a precarious financial crutch. A single shock could topple everything. And then, in 1857, the shock arrives, not from China, but from within India itself. A rebellion so ferocious, so widespread, and so unexpected that it nearly ends British rule altogether. The Sepoy Mutiny, the Indian Rebellion, the uprising that changes everything. Only now does Britain realize the truth. By allowing a corporation to accumulate the power of a state, it has created a structure too large to regulate, too complex to control, and too morally compromised to sustain. It is the first great lesson in systemic risk. The first modern example of a corporation becoming too big to fail, yet simultaneously too corrupt to endure. And the consequences, economic, political, spiritual, are about to explode. There are fortunes that gleam like polished gold under sunlight, and then there are fortunes that seem to absorb the light around them, giving off a darker shimmer. Robert Clive's wealth belongs to the latter. It is a fortune whispered about in London parlors, feared in Calcutta's bazaars, and envied across Europe. A fortune so vast, so sudden, so unnatural in scale that it seemed less like wealth and more like a spell cast upon a man and upon an empire. To understand Clive's fall, we must return to the moment of his ascent. Imagine him stepping off a ship on the Thames in 1760, returning from India for the second time. The London he enters is a world of fog-choked streets, clattering carriage wheels, and aristocrats wrapped in velvet cloaks. Yet even among the gilded nobility, Clive stands out. He is a young man, barely in his mid-30s, but already spoken of as a conqueror. His victory at Plassey has reshaped the world. His negotiations and betrayals have placed Bengal at the feet of a corporation, and his personal treasury, overflowing with jewels, silver, estates, and bribes disguised as gifts, has made him one of the richest men in the British Isles. People stare when he enters a room, some with admiration, others with unease. For Clive carries something no one else does, the scent of empire freshly carved. He buys enormous estates, including Claremont House, a mansion so grand that visitors describe it with reverence. He fills its halls with Indian treasures, dazzling diamonds, rubies the size of acorns, Persian carpets woven with gold thread, ivory inlaid furniture, Ming vases, sword hilts engraved with emeralds. His dinners become legendary. His political influence grows. Members of Parliament court his favor. Even the king hears his name. But beneath this glittering exterior, something hollow begins to form. Friends notice that Clive does not sleep well. Servants whisper that he sometimes wanders the halls of Claremont at night, restless, pacing like a general inspecting a battlefield no one else can see. In private letters, he admits to feeling a disquiet of the mind. The fortune that was supposed to secure his peace instead tightens around him like a vice. It is not guilt alone that troubles him. It is the knowledge, perhaps too clear, too brutally honest, that his fortune was built not on entrepreneurship, but on exploitation, bribes, extortion, manipulation, the extraction of wealth from a starving province. This is the first shadow of his curse. Yet London society, intoxicated by his myth, refuses to see it. They celebrate him, toast him, write plays about him. Newspapers call him the heaven-born general. Young men beg him for patronage. Merchants offer him shares. Politicians flatter him in hopes of tapping into his limitless resources. But envy also grows. The old aristocracy watches this self-made man rise like a comet, and their pride stiffens. They murmur that he lacks breeding, that his wealth is unclean, that he is too ambitious, too bold, too dangerous. Whispers accumulate like dust in corners. Then the scandals arrive. In the late 1760s, reports begin to surface of company corruption in Bengal. Famines devastate the region. Millions die, and someone must be blamed. Clive becomes the perfect target. Parliament summons him to answer for the company's abuses. The debates become spectacle. Crowds gather outside Westminster to watch the man who conquered Bengal defend his honor. Inside the chamber, Clive stands alone before a semicircle of powerful men, some of whom owe their fortunes to the company, but now pretend innocence. They accuse him of extortion, of bribery, of plunder, of creating a system so greedy that it destabilized an entire province. Clive, for all his faults, is still a man of formidable intelligence. His defense is legendary. He admits to accepting gifts, but insists that he refused far more than he took. In one of the most quoted moments in parliamentary history, he reportedly says, "I stand astonished at my own moderation." It is a line dripping with irony, perhaps intentional, perhaps born of desperation. The inquiry continues for months. Witnesses testify. Letters are examined. The public grows obsessed. London taverns buzz with speculation. Caricature artists depict Clive as a tiger, a devil, a king, a tyrant. Some praise him. Many condemn him. Eventually, Parliament acquits him. Not because they believe he is innocent, but because they fear that condemning Clive means condemning the very empire that now enriches them. But acquittal does not bring peace. When Clive returns to his estate, something in him has changed. The applause he once basked in now seems hollow. The accusations cling to him. His health deteriorates. His old affliction, melancholy, what we would now call chronic depression, tightens its grip. He turns to opium and laudanum to quiet his mind. He isolates himself. Visitors describe him as pale, withdrawn, haunted. A friend writes in his journal, "Something follows him, a shadow of his own making." By 1774, Clive retreats almost entirely from public life. That year, on a cold November night, he locks himself in a room. The details are uncertain. Some claim accident, others claim intentionality. But by morning, Robert Clive is dead. He is only 49. If his rise was meteoric, his fall is tragic. His legacy becomes a battleground. Some revere him as the founder of the British Empire in India. Others revile him as the architect of suffering. Modern historians remain divided. But the deeper truth lies not in the debate, but in the pattern his life reveals. Wealth taken without balance corrodes the taker. Power accumulated without integrity fractures the holder. Success built on exploitation becomes a curse. Clive's curse. A curse that would soon seep through the company itself, twisting its fortunes, poisoning its reputation, and dragging it toward catastrophe. If Robert Clive's life had ended merely as the story of a brilliant but troubled conqueror, history might have granted him a simpler legacy. But legacies do not fade when a man dies. They echo. They warp. They become symbols, warnings, arguments, and weapons. After Clive's death in 1774, the shadow he cast did not disappear. It deepened. It slipped into the halls of Parliament, into the counting rooms of the East India Company, into the villages of Bengal, and into the imaginations of historians for centuries to come. Clive's death forces Britain to confront an uncomfortable truth. The empire has created something it cannot fully control. The East India Company is no longer merely a trading entity. It is a governing force, a military power, and for many, the embodiment of everything Clive represents: ambition, brilliance, greed, and moral blindness woven together into one powerful organism. In the years following Clive's death, a new tide of criticism rises in Britain. Writers, activists, and philosophers begin questioning the company's ethics with unprecedented intensity. One of the most influential voices is Edmund Burke, whose fiery speeches in Parliament dissect the company's crimes with surgical precision. Burke is not merely criticizing policy. He is diagnosing a spiritual disease eating away at the heart of the British imperial project. He calls it tyranny. He calls it corruption. He calls it a stain on Britain's conscience. Burke's most passionate target is Warren Hastings, Clive's successor as Governor-General of Bengal and one of the most powerful men in Asia. Hastings is brilliant, cultured, and deeply complex, yet embroiled in accusations of extortion, manipulation, and administrative cruelty. He is not Clive, but he walks in Clive's footsteps. And it is those footsteps that lead Burke to wage one of the most dramatic political battles of the age, the impeachment of Hastings. The trial becomes a national obsession. It lasts 7 years. Crowds flood Westminster Hall. Artists capture the scene in grand paintings where Burke appears almost like a prophet of moral judgment. Hastings, dignified but weary, sits listening to accusations that echo the very criticisms once hurled at Clive. The haunting irony is impossible to ignore. Clive is dead, yet he is everywhere in the trial. Not named, but present. Not accused, but evoked. A silent ghost in every argument. Burke speaks not just to condemn Hastings, but to condemn an entire system of corporate rule that Clive helped forge, one that rewards exploitation, encourages secrecy, and punishes empathy. Meanwhile, in India, the consequences of Clive's legacy unfold with grim clarity. Bengal, once a flourishing center of textile production and agricultural wealth, struggles under crushing taxation and administrative incompetence. Local aristocrats lose autonomy. Village economies collapse. In some regions, desertion becomes common, farmers fleeing their lands to escape unbearable revenue demands. Observers describe a strange paradox. The company becomes richer as Bengal becomes poorer. This imbalance becomes one of the most controversial subjects of British debate. Pamphlets circulate with titles like The Plunder of India and The Crimes of the Company. One clergyman preaches that the British Empire now eats its bread in the tears of foreign widows. Another calls the company a devouring beast disguised as a merchant. Slowly, a new narrative forms in the public imagination. Clive is no longer just a hero or villain. He becomes a symbol of forbidden wealth, a figure whose successes came at the cost of India's suffering and Britain's moral integrity. This perception begins to exert pressure on the political structure itself. Parliament attempts new regulatory measures. The Regulating Act of 1773, passed during Clive's final years, is followed by Pitt's India Act of 1784. These acts attempt to tame the company, to place it under partial government oversight, to create checks and balances. But the company resists. It is too wealthy, too influential, too deeply woven into Britain's economy. Shareholders argue that government interference threatens national prosperity. Merchants warn that restricting the company will collapse trade. Politicians hesitate. The monarchy observes silently. Thus, the company survives, wounded but still powerful, still growing, still expanding its armies, its territories, its influence. But the world around it is changing. A new kind of skepticism takes root, not only in Parliament, but among the British public. Even schoolboys begin learning the story of Clive not as a heroic conquest, but as a cautionary tale. His death becomes a moral parable whispered in drawing rooms. He conquered kingdoms, but he could not conquer himself. His melancholy becomes a metaphor for imperial guilt. His suicide becomes a symbol of the psychological cost of ill-gotten power. His legacy becomes a warning carved into the early architecture of empire. A fortune taken without balance becomes a burden. A victory won without justice becomes a wound. An empire built on extraction becomes a prison for those who rule it. Meanwhile, the company, still intoxicated by the profits of opium, land revenue, and trade monopolies, continues expanding. But beneath its triumphs lies a creeping instability, financial stress, administrative chaos, growing unrest among sepoys, rising resentment among Indian princes, factionalism within its own leadership. The empire Clive built is beginning to rot from within, and as the structure weakens, something else begins to gather in the distance, a storm of rebellion and karmic return that will strike with devastating force. By the early 19th century, the East India Company has grown so large, so deeply entrenched in the machinery of empire, that it appears unshakable. Its directors walk through London with the quiet confidence of men who believe history bends to their ledgers. Its officers rule Indian provinces with the authority of monarchs. Its coffers swell with opium revenue, land taxes, trade monopolies, and the wealth extracted from millions of people who never chose to be governed by a corporation. Yet something subtle and profoundly dangerous has begun to weave its way through the company's foundation. A curse, not the supernatural kind, but the human kind, the psychological kind, the kind that germinates in the hearts of powerful men who carry more wealth than wisdom, more authority than understanding, more ambition than balance. The curse that claimed Robert Clive does not die with him. It metastasizes. It seeps into the culture of the company itself. Letters from junior company officers describe a disturbing pattern. Men newly arrived in India are dazzled by the ease with which power is obtained, wealth accumulated, and rules bent. Some enter the service with noble intentions, hoping to bring justice and order. But within months, they are seduced by the same temptations that once hollowed Clive's spirit. Bribery disguised as gifts, land claims taken through legal loopholes, extravagant lifestyles built upon the poverty of those they govern. A senior official in Calcutta writes that the company's culture corrupts even the formerly decent. Another confesses that he feels the ghost of Clive whispering in every decision. This is the second form of Clive's curse, a moral contagion that passes from one generation of company servants to the next. But the third and most devastating form of the curse is structural. It lies not in individuals, but in the machine itself. After Clive's death, the company's administration expands at a staggering rate. More provinces come under its control. More taxes must be collected. More troops must be paid. More fortresses must be built. More bureaucrats must be hired. Every year, the cost of maintaining the empire grows higher, and yet the company remains obsessed with squeezing greater profits from its territories. This imbalance grows until it becomes a grotesque paradox. The richer the company becomes, the more unstable it becomes. Reports from Bengal tell of villages unable to meet revenue demands, Reports from Madras tell of farmers abandoning their lands. Reports from Bombay tell of merchants fleeing to avoid oppressive duties. These are not isolated incidents. They are cracks in the foundation. In the 1820s, the company begins to rely more heavily on opium revenue to cover administrative costs. This dependence becomes so intense that company officials quietly admit, though only in private, that without opium, the entire financial structure could collapse. This is the fourth form of Clive's curse. A system built on extraction becomes dependent on extraction. Like a man who drinks poison daily because he cannot survive without it. Meanwhile, in Britain, the public's view of the company continues to shift. Newspapers publish investigations exposing corruption. Philosophers write essays questioning the morality of empire. Economists warn that a corporation ruling 200 million people is a recipe for disaster. Members of Parliament argue that the company has grown arrogant, defiant, and insulated from accountability. Some call for nationalization. Others demand reform. A few suggest dissolution. And then, in 1856, a spark lights the fuse. The company issues a new rifle cartridge coated with animal fat. Using it requires biting the cartridge. For Hindu soldiers, it is an offense to their religion. For Muslim soldiers, it is equally forbidden. Warnings from sepoys are ignored. Rumors spread like wildfire. Officers dismiss them with arrogance. And the tension that has been simmering for decades finally ignites. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 erupts with volcanic force. Sepoy regiments rise up. Civilians join them. Princes fund them. Entire provinces rebel against company rule. The company, once confident in its immortality, finds itself on the brink of collapse. For the first time in its history, the private empire trembles. The rebellion reveals everything that had been building beneath the surface: resentment, cultural insensitivity, economic repression, religious offenses, political arrogance, and the deep psychological wounds inflicted by decades of exploitation. This is the fifth and most devastating form of Clive's curse: the karmic return. The rebellion becomes so fierce that Britain is forced to intervene directly. The company cannot contain it. The British Crown must send its own troops, its own money, its own administrators. And when the rebellion is finally crushed, Parliament passes the Government of India Act of 1858. The East India Company, the most powerful corporation in history, is dissolved, its territories transferred to the British Crown, its armies absorbed, its administrative rights revoked, its very existence erased from the present, preserved only in the archives of empire. The private empire Clive created, the empire that made him one of the richest men of his age and the most tormented man of his final years, collapses under the weight of its own moral contradictions. This is Clive's true legacy, not victory, not conquest, not wealth, but a warning. Every empire built on extraction eventually extracts from itself. Every fortune built on imbalance eventually turns inward like a blade. Every system built on unchecked ambition eventually collapses under the gravity of its own excess. Clive's curse is not about ghosts or destiny. It is about human nature. and it is about the invisible laws that govern power, wealth, and consequence. There are monuments the world remembers, pyramids, walls, towers, temples. And then there are monuments the world forgets, even though they once stretched across the earth like the spine of a sleeping giant. The Great Hedge of India is one of these forgotten titans. A barrier so vast, so improbable, so stubbornly artificial that even those who read history rarely believe it existed. Yet for decades, it cut through the plains of northern India like a scar, symbolizing one of the strangest and most revealing obsessions of the East India Company: the belief that control, if built high enough and guarded fiercely enough, could defeat the forces of human nature. To understand how such a thing came into being, imagine riding through northern India in the mid-19th century. The landscape is immense, rolling endlessly with fields of millet, mustard, and sugarcane. Dust rises like faint smoke on the horizon. Herds of goats and cattle wander along ancient footpaths. Villagers carry bundles of firewood balanced on their heads. The air hums with cicadas under the brutal sun. And then, suddenly, you see it. An immense wall, not of stone but of thorn. A living wall, thick, dense, twisted. It stretches farther than the eye can follow. A barrier of acacia, babool, prickly pear, and thorny shrubs interwoven by hand, fortified with ditches, guarded by patrols, and maintained with almost religious discipline. Nearly 4,000 kilometers long, longer than the entire length of the Great Wall of China in its original form. A boundary so immense that even company officers joked it could be seen by God. But this hedge was not built to defend the empire from invaders. It was built to stop salt. Salt, the simplest and most essential of minerals. Salt, the element that preserves, heals, and sustains life. Salt that villagers traded freely for centuries. Salt that flowed along footpaths, across rivers, between communities, without permission. Salt that the company decided must be taxed with absolute rigidity. The company's salt tax was one of the most hated in India. It squeezed the poor mercilessly and generated enormous revenue for the company's growing administrative machine. But enforcing it was difficult. Smuggling became a way of life. Entire villages participated. Traders moved secretly at night. Animals carried concealed loads. Corrupt officials looked the other way. The company saw salt slipping through its fingers like water and panicked. Control. This was the company's instinctive reaction to fear, not adaptation, not understanding. Control. And so, in a fever dream of bureaucratic logic, a plan was born. Build a hedge across India. A hedge so thick, so tall, so treacherous that no person or pack animal could cross it without being shredded. The idea started small, as all impossible ideas do. A few thorn barriers, a few guarded posts. But ambition, once ignited, grows like wildfire in the minds of men who mistake expansion for progress. Each revenue officer who inspected the hedge proposed extensions. Each administrator insisted on thicker sections. Each governor demanded more uniformity, more discipline, more control. Soon, the hedge consumed budgets, manpower, and imagination. Workers dug trenches, planted thorny saplings, reinforced weak spots with mud walls and ditches. Entire teams were assigned to irrigate certain sections so the plants would grow thick and fierce. In dry areas, dead branches were woven together into a spiked lattice. During the hot seasons, guards patrolled with buckets of water to keep the hedge alive. In colder regions, fires were lit to protect the shrubs from frost. The hedge became an obsession, a living monument to paranoia, a testament to administrative tunnel vision, a physical manifestation of the company's anxiety toward chaos. Yet for all its absurdity, the hedge worked, at least for a while. Smuggling routes shifted. Villagers were forced to take longer paths. Salt became harder to obtain. The company's revenues increased. But the hedge also became a symbol of tyranny. Travelers cursed it. Farmers resented its blockages. Entire communities found themselves divided by a barrier that had no cultural, geographical, or spiritual meaning, only economic purpose. Reports from company inspectors reveal the surreal nature of maintaining such a structure. In one letter, an officer describes how wild animals continually broke gaps in the hedge, requiring constant repair. In another, a guard recounts how desperate villagers crawled through thorns until their clothes tore and their skin bled. During monsoon seasons, parts of the hedge rotted and collapsed, forcing thousands of laborers to rebuild them from scratch. There are even stories of storms lifting entire sections and hurling them across fields like giant mats of thorns. Still, the company persisted, because the hedge was more than a tool. It was a philosophy, a belief that human ingenuity could outmatch nature, that bureaucracy could outmatch community, that a wall, any wall, could stop the flow of something as fundamental as salt. But walls built from fear never last. They rot from within, and beneath the surface of the hedge, beneath the structure that stretched across India like a twisted serpent, something else was happening. Something subtle, dangerous, and entirely predictable. The tighter the company tried to control the salt trade, the more ingenious the smugglers became. The higher the hedge rose, the more resentment it inspired. The more resources it consumed, the weaker the company's finances grew. The more rigid the system became, the more it resisted necessary change. Control was becoming the company's downfall. And the hedge, grand and grotesque as it was, would one day become the perfect symbol of its delusion. If the great hedge were merely a wall of thorns, it would be a curiosity, an eccentric footnote in the long ledger of empire. But what makes it extraordinary, what makes it almost tragic, is how perfectly it reveals the inner psychology of the East India Company. For behind every thorn in that colossal barrier lies a deeper truth. The company feared disorder more than it understood it, and in this fear, it tried to command the world through geometry, taxation, and force. To grasp this strange psychology, imagine standing beside a high-ranking company administrator as he inspects a section of the hedge near Etawah in the 1840s. The sun is merciless. Dust clings to his boots. His uniform clings to his back. But his eyes are fixed on the hedge with a mix of pride and irritation. He sees not a wall of thorns, but a line of control. A measurable, maintainable, enforceable barrier. an instrument to tidy the chaos of millions of Indian lives into neat columns of accounting. He demands that the hedge be reinforced, that the guards be more vigilant, that the ditches be dug deeper, that the salt revenue continue to rise. And yet, if you look beyond him, you see a different world entirely. On the other side of the hedge, a group of women gather at dawn, discussing how they will circumvent the barrier to obtain cheap salt for their families. A young boy scouts for gaps in the thorns. A caravan master studies the hedge's shadows, planning a night crossing. A smuggler teaches his apprentice how to crawl on his side, shifting weight carefully to avoid the longest spikes. Here, in the dust and silence of the plains, two forms of intelligence face each other: bureaucratic logic and ordinary human survival. And it is always the latter that endures. Company documents from the period, often written in stiff, frustrated English, reveal how salt smuggling evolved into a sophisticated parallel economy. Smugglers learned to bribe guards with small amounts of silver or precious cloth. Traders carved secret tunnels beneath weaker sections. Farmers hid salt inside clay pots covered with grain to fool inspectors. Entire villages coordinated mass distractions, sending herds of cattle stampeding toward guards while a dozen men slipped quietly through gaps in the hedge. The more the company tightened its grip, the more creative India became in resisting. But the hedge was not only a barrier to smugglers, it became a barrier to people themselves. Travelers found their usual routes blocked. Families were separated by a wall that did not exist in any tradition. Communities that once moved freely between markets were now trapped in administrative boxes. Caravans had to take detours so long they risked starvation in summer heat. Entire trade routes, centuries old, became inconvenient or impossible. In one account from the 1840s, a British traveler describes spending half a day searching for a legal crossing point, only to discover a small gate guarded by sepoys who demanded taxes and inspections on every item carried. He wrote, "It was as though I were traveling not through a land, but through a maze designed by bureaucrats." Meanwhile, the hedge consumed enormous resources. Thousands of laborers, hundreds of guards' acres of land, endless hours of maintenance irrigation channels dug just to keep the thorns alive. The constant replacement of dead sections, the reinforcement of weak spots, the bureaucratic paperwork required to monitor it. In some regions, the hedge was so thick it could stop a charging elephant. In others, it wilted in the heat, forcing officials to plant new sections over and over again. One inspector, in a rare moment of honesty, wrote, "This hedge is a creature with an appetite. It grows on our budgets like a beast." But the greatest cost was not financial. It was ideological. The hedge became a metaphor for a deeper flaw in the company's soul. The belief that order can be engineered, that human behavior can be confined, that life can be taxed into obedience, that entitlement can replace empathy, that systems can be perfected through force. This illusion of control seeped into every aspect of company rule. It shaped how administrators viewed villagers, merchants, sepoys, and entire provinces. It taught them to mistake suppression for governance and compliance for stability. And like all illusions, it began to show cracks. Monsoon storms tore holes in the hedge. Termites hollowed out branches. Dry winds carried embers that set whole sections ablaze. Birds nested in vulnerable areas, weakening structural density. Wild boars smashed through with brute force. Salt smugglers widened every opening the moment it appeared. Each repair demanded money, manpower, and attention that the company desperately needed elsewhere, especially as political tensions simmered, as financial pressures grew, and as sepoy grievances deepened into quiet anger. The hedge became a distraction, a resource sink, a monument that looked like strength but behaved like weakness. And gradually, even company officials began to question it. Some argued in private letters that the hedge was a monstrous folly. Others suggested abandoning it entirely. But no one dared to dismantle it. The revenue depended too heavily on salt taxation. And revenue was the heart that kept the company alive. So the hedge continued, and continued, and continued, until one day it met a force it could not resist. Not smugglers, not storms, not dry heat or monsoon rain, but something far more inevitable: the collapse of the company itself. When the rebellion of 1857 erupts, the hedge becomes irrelevant overnight. Patrols abandon their posts. Guards flee. Laborers disappear. Salt smugglers move freely again. By the time the British Crown finally takes control from the East India Company, the hedge is left to wither. Some parts are uprooted. Others are burned. Most are simply swallowed by time, disappearing into the soil like the memory of a fevered dream. Today, only fragments remain. Dry shrubs here, a ruined ditch there. But the hedge still speaks, not through its branches, but through its symbolism, because it shows us something crucial about the company's fate. You cannot build a wall strong enough to prevent the consequences of your own choices. You cannot hedge against karmic debt. You cannot force stability upon a system that is cracking beneath you. Control is not the same as order. And control without wisdom is simply fear wearing the costume of authority. As the great hedge began to wither, both physically and symbolically, the East India Company entered the final phase of its existence, one defined not by conquest or confidence, but by exhaustion. The hedge had always been a mirror, reflecting back the company's growing anxiety, its obsession with control, its fear of unpredictability. But now, as rebellion stirred and administration faltered, that mirror transformed into a window showing the vast and fragile machinery behind the illusion of power. To truly understand the hedge as a lesson, we must step into the mindset of the men who built it. They did not believe they were creating a monstrous, absurd, sprawling thorn labyrinth. They believed they were creating order. In their minds, chaos was the enemy. Smugglers were a threat. Revenue was the lifeblood. And the hedge, improbable, awkward, colossal, appeared to be a solution. This reveals something profound. Imperial arrogance rarely looks like arrogance from the inside. It looks like practicality. It looks like logic. It looks like efficiency. It looks like stability. And this, more than anything else, made the company dangerous. The hedge becomes their metaphorical backbone, stiff, brittle, inflexible, unable to bend, unable to adapt, only able to resist. And resistance, when applied against the natural flow of human behavior, always breaks. Consider a small village near Kanpur in the early 1850s. A salt smuggler named Hariram is caught attempting to drag 2 sacks of salt beneath a weak section of the hedge. His hands bleed from the thorns. His ankles are torn. But he does not beg for forgiveness. He simply says, "My children need to eat." To the company official recording his arrest, this is trivial information. A line in a ledger. A crime. But to Hariram, this hedge is a wall cutting through the rhythm of his life, imposing a foreign will upon his survival. Multiply Hariram by millions and you begin to see the truth. The hedge did not merely block movement. It blocked dignity. It blocked tradition. It blocked autonomy. It turned the company from a merchant into an oppressor, even in moments where oppression was not the intention. And yet the hedge persisted because the company depended on the salt tax. They needed revenue to fund their sprawling army, their administrative networks, their opulent lifestyles, and their generous dividends to shareholders far away in London. The hedge was not a symbol of cruelty. It was a symbol of dependency. Dependency on extraction. Dependency on rigidity. Dependency on control. Dependency is the true curse of all empires. Not rebellion. Not invasion. Dependency. By the mid-1850s, the hedge consumed so much labor and money that its usefulness began to collapse under its own weight. British reports describe entire sections falling apart faster than they could be repaired. One officer complains that 20 miles of hedge had to be rebuilt after a single storm. Another reports that termites had devoured kilometers of dried thornwood. Guards lacked discipline. Bribes flowed. Smugglers grew bolder. The hedge no longer protected revenue. It devoured it. Then came 1857, the rebellion. The breaking point. As sepoys marched, as villages rose, as cities burned, the hedge became an absurdity. Guards abandoned their posts. Whole stretches of thorn barrier remained unattended. People walked through freely, carrying salt as if walking through a ghost. In some regions, villagers tore it apart in celebration, using branches for firewood. In others, it burned like kindling under the summer sun. The hedge vanished, not through policy, but through irrelevance. When the British Crown officially dissolved the East India Company after the rebellion, one of the first decisions of the new administration was to abandon the hedge completely. Men who had once spent their careers tending it now turned to other duties. The hedge, once the company's proud symbol of control, was stripped of all meaning. Slowly, quietly, nature reclaimed it. Thorns returned to wild bushes. Trenches filled with mud and monsoon water. Patrol roads were swallowed by grass. Entire sections disappeared beneath the slow drift of dust and time. By the early 20th century, only scraps of the hedge remained. By the late 20th century, even those scraps were nearly forgotten. Today, only a few historians, A handful of villagers and the occasional archaeologist know where fragments lie. But the lesson remains. Perhaps the most important lesson in the entire story of the East India Company. The company believed that if it built a wall tall enough, thick enough, ruthless enough, it could force the world into compliance. But walls cannot protect an empire from its own internal rot. Walls cannot shield a system from the consequences of its decisions. Walls cannot preserve control when the people behind the wall lose faith. And no wall, whether built of stone, steel, law, or thorns, can stop the return of karma. Because control is never real unless it is paired with wisdom. Systems collapse when they refuse to adapt. And the company, in its hunger to dominate, forgot one essential truth. Entropy always wins. What the hedge truly represents is not power, but fragility, disguised as power. It is the perfect symbol of what happens when an institution mistakes rigidity for strength. A reminder that the tighter you grip the world, the more it slips through your fingers. The great hedge of India stands today not in the soil, but in the memory of history. A whisper, almost comedic, yet profoundly revealing. A monument to the illusion that control can conquer complexity. And it marks the final quiet descent before the storm of the next chapter, the rebellion that would shatter the company forever. There are moments in history when the world seems to hold its breath, moments when the quiet murmurs of discontent, long ignored, sharpen into a single, piercing cry. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 was one of those moments. A lightning strike after decades of gathering storm clouds. And if one looks closely, the rebellion did not erupt suddenly. It flowed slowly through the company's empire like cracks beneath the surface of ice, expanding silently until the weight above could no longer hold. To understand the eruption, we must enter the life of the sepoy, the Indian soldier who formed the backbone of the company's mighty private army. His world was one of discipline and duty, but also of dignity, caste, ritual, and identity. The company never truly understood those final four elements, and it was this ignorance, this spiritual blindness, that would deliver the karmic blow. Imagine a sepoy in the 1850s. His name might be Ram Singh, or Abdul Rahman, or Karim Ali, or Bhim Prasad. He wakes before dawn, the sky still washed in indigo. He attends roll call. He eats simple rations. He polishes his musket until it gleams. He marches in formation under the barked commands of British officers, many of whom are barely older than boys, fresh from academies in London and Edinburgh. The sepoy's loyalty is not trivial. For many, the company provides steady pay, structure, prestige, and a sense of belonging. Their fathers or uncles may have served before them. They have pride in their regiments, in their uniforms, in their training. But beneath that pride lies a growing unease. It begins with changes too small to notice. A newly appointed officer who mocks Hindu rituals. A pay reduction justified by budgets. Long postings far from home, forcing sepoys of high caste to serve beside those considered ritually incompatible. Rumors that the company intends to Christianize the army. Policies that ignore local customs and punish grievances with cold indifference. These small humiliations accumulate like grains of sand, and as every grain falls, the weight increases. But the company remains blind. Its officers see sepoys as replaceable elements of a machine, not as men with sacred boundaries woven into their identities. Then comes the final insult: the spark, the new Enfield rifle cartridge. To load the rifle, sepoys must bite the cartridge open. Rumors spread that the cartridges are greased with cow fat, an abomination to Hindus, and pig fat, an abomination to Muslims. Both communities are outraged. Religious purity is not a trivial matter. It is a pillar of their existence. British officers dismiss their concerns. They claim the rumors are nonsense. They quench legitimate fears with arrogance. But whispers move faster than orders, and whispers are far more powerful. The spark ignites in Meerut. A group of sepoys refuse to bite the cartridges. They are arrested, shackled, and humiliated in front of their entire regiment. The spectacle is meant to intimidate. Instead, it transforms resentment into fire. The next day, May 10th, 1857, the sepoys revolt. They free their imprisoned comrades. They attack British officers. They march toward Delhi, shouting the words that had been buried under decades of fear and obedience: "We will no longer bow." The rebellion spreads like monsoon floodwater. From Meerut to Delhi, from Kanpur to Lucknow, from Jhansi to Bihar, from the plains to the cities to the villages. This is not a small protest. It is a spiritual uprising, a cultural resurgence, a cry of a nation fractured by a foreign corporation's greed. In Delhi, the rebels restore the aging Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, as a symbolic leader. He is old, frail, and weary, but his presence gives the uprising a banner, a memory, a dignity that had been stolen. In Kanpur, Nana Sahib rises. In Jhansi, Rani Lakshmibai, one of the most extraordinary figures in Indian history, mounts her horse and becomes a warrior queen, her sword flashing like lightning across the battlefield. British accounts describe her with astonishment. She fights with a fearlessness that becomes legend. Women across India whisper her name. British officers write of her with both admiration and dread. Meanwhile, the company is paralyzed. Its communication lines collapse. Its officers flee or are overwhelmed. Entire regiments defect. Villages seize the moment to strike back against oppressive landlords imposed by company rule. The empire that seemed eternal now appears fragile, exposed, mortal. The karmic return has begun. For decades, the company harvested obedience without offering respect, collected revenue without offering justice, exerted control without offering understanding. And now, all at once, the consequences return with compounded force. In Calcutta, company officials panic. In London, Parliament is stunned. Newspapers speak of mutiny, betrayal, and savagery, avoiding the more uncomfortable truth. This was not a mutiny. This was the inevitable backlash of a system that had mistaken fear for stability. The rebellion burns across the subcontinent for over a year. It is brutal. It is chaotic. It is tragic, and yet profoundly human. When an empire ignores the humanity of the people it governs, humanity rises to remind the empire of its limits. The company eventually regains control with the help of British reinforcements, but not through strength, through desperation, through the raw might of the crown stepping in where the company failed. And when the dust settles, the East India Company is mortally wounded, not militarily, but morally, politically, structurally. The rebellion has exposed everything: the corruption, the arrogance, the incompetence, the fragility behind the facade of power. This was not a rebellion. It was a reckoning. By the summer of 1857, the rebellion had become a storm without a single center, an uprising woven from hundreds of grievances, thousands of lives, and the collective anguish of a population held under a foreign corporation's rule. Every region had its own reasons for rising. Every community its own history of wounds. And in each pocket of resistance, you can trace a thread that leads back to the same source, a system that pushed until it broke. To see the full picture, we must walk through the cities consumed by the rebellion, their streets, their forts, their whispered memories. Begin with Delhi. When the first wave of sepoys from Meerut thundered through the city gates, the people of Delhi seemed to awaken from decades of humiliation. The Mughal Empire, once a jewel of the world, had been reduced to a ceremonial shadow by the company. The aging emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, lived in a palace whose walls still whispered poetry, but whose treasury had long been emptied. His ancestors once commanded armies that swept across Central Asia. Now, he signed documents that were essentially irrelevant. And yet, when the sepoys raised their swords and declared him emperor once more, something stirred. Old loyalties flared. Poets penned verses of revival. Merchants offered supplies. Citizens crowded around the Red Fort, weeping with disbelief that Delhi, even briefly, might belong to Indians again. But power regained through rebellion is fragile. The rebels lacked coordination. The emperor lacked authority. The company, though stunned, was not defeated. It was regrouping. Now look to Kanpur. Kanpur was not merely a military post, it was a symbol of British civilian life. Bungalows shaded by trees, churches with whitewashed walls, officers' clubs echoing with piano music, carriages rolling along dusty roads. Yet beneath this delicate veneer lay decades of resentment. Nana Sahib, heir to the Maratha Peshwas, had been denied a pension the company once promised. The insult festered. When the rebellion reached Kanpur, Nana Sahib seized his moment. For a brief, intense period, he became the figurehead of a local uprising filled with a mixture of vengeance, grief, and desperation. Kanpur became one of the bloodiest theaters of the rebellion. Tragedies unfolded on both sides, horrors committed by rebels and reprisals delivered by company forces. Letters written by survivors read like nightmares etched in ink. Nana Sahib's fate remains a mystery. Some claim he died in Nepal, others that he lived in disguise. But in Kanpur's dust, his name still clings like an unresolved echo. Then turn to Lucknow. Lucknow's residency became the site of one of the longest and most dramatic sieges in colonial history. Surrounded by rebel forces, British civilians and soldiers endured months of starvation, disease, and constant shelling. Diaries describe nights lit by the orange glow of burning houses, the sound of shells thundering into courtyards, mothers clutching children under tables, hoping walls would hold. Yet outside the residency, another world surged with energy, rebels reclaiming their streets, nobles reorganizing defenses, ordinary citizens joining the uprising. In Lucknow, the rebellion did not feel like a mutiny. It felt like a war for the soul of a kingdom. And then there is Jhansi. No city symbolizes pure resolve and unshakable courage like Jhansi. When British officers annexed the kingdom under the infamous doctrine of lapse, they dismissed the rights of its queen, Rani Lakshmibai, a widow, a mother, a woman underestimated by an empire. But when rebellion erupted, Rani Lakshmibai did not hesitate. She strapped on armor, mounted her horse, took command of her forces. British officers would later write of her as the most dangerous of all rebel leaders, yet also with reluctant admiration, her bravery undeniable. Imagine her riding into battle, sword raised, sari tucked like a warrior's garment, her adopted son strapped to her back, the dust swirling around her horse's hooves, the cries of her soldiers rising like thunder. She fought with a ferocity that became legend. Even in death, she became immortal. Her resistance revealed the truth the company refused to see. Indian loyalty was never shallow. It was simply stretched too far. Meanwhile, British retaliation across India becomes brutal. Desperate attempts to regain control. Company officers who once sipped tea and maintained ledgers now order executions, burn villages, and impose martial law. The veneer of civilized governance collapses, revealing raw imperial violence underneath. British newspapers reassure the public with sanitized reports. But private letters tell a different story, full of fear, rage, and moral disintegration. The company, as an institution, begins to split under the pressure. Some officials argue for reform, others cling to dominance. Many simply lose their nerve. Finance, the invisible engine of empire, also begins to tremble. Revenue collapses in rebel-held regions. Salt taxes become irrelevant. Opium shipments stall. Share prices fluctuate wildly in London. Investors panic. It becomes clear that the company cannot sustain itself without constant military support from the crown. What was once a proud symbol of corporate efficiency now reveals itself as a fragile, overstretched, morally compromised entity that cannot survive a systemic shock. The rebellion forces Britain to confront a truth it avoided for decades. The East India Company is no longer an asset. It is a liability. The karmic return is complete. Everything the company suppressed, identity, dignity, grievance, culture, erupts at once. Everything it ignored becomes unmanageable. Everything it extracted demands repayment. This is not abstract karma. It is structural, human, inevitable. And as the rebellion reaches its final months, a transformation begins in London that will seal the company's fate forever. As the rebellion raged across the plains and cities of India, the East India Company's power once so absolute, so unquestioned, so deeply woven into the machinery of empire, began to unravel thread by thread. And the greatest unraveling did not happen on the battlefield. It happened in the quiet chambers of London, where men who had once praised the company now regarded it with a mixture of fear, disgust, and disbelief. Because beneath the noise of the rebellion lay a truth that Parliament could no longer ignore. The company had lost the moral, administrative, and financial capacity to govern. The first blow came from the reports. Thick packets of letters, diaries, testimonies, and official dispatches arrived on wooden desks in Westminster. They carried more than facts. They carried a stench of incompetence, of cruelty, of brutality met with brutality. Words trembled in the pages. Some described massacres committed by rebels. Others described massacres committed by company troops in retaliation. Some recorded villages burned to ash. Others described entire families executed on suspicion alone. The rebellion exposed everything the company tried to hide: its brittle administrative structure, its reckless handling of religious sensitivities, its exploitation of resources, its inability to understand the people it governed, its addiction to revenue over stability. The company had claimed it brought civilization. The rebellion revealed it brought suffering. In Parliament, the debates turned venomous. Prominent voices condemned the company as an administrative abomination. Others called it a corporation drunk on its own profits. Even those who once defended it now stepped back, wary of public opinion. Newspapers in London printed editorials questioning how a single corporation came to rule millions. Cartoons depicted the company as a monstrous octopus, its tentacles choking India while simultaneously strangling Britain's moral conscience. Preachers spoke of divine punishment. Intellectuals wrote essays arguing that corporate power must never again be allowed to reach such heights. The East India Company had become too big to fail, but also too corrupt to save. And in that paradox lay its doom. While London debated, the rebellion's final battles raged. Delhi fell. Lucknow fell. Jhansi fell only after Rani Lakshmibai died on the battlefield, her death described by witnesses as a comet falling across the sky. Kanpur collapsed into chaos. The final strongholds were crushed by British reinforcement armies, not the company's private troops, but crown soldiers sent from across the empire. This detail mattered. Without crown intervention, the company would have lost India outright. And that realization struck Parliament like cold steel. A private corporation that needs public armies to survive cannot be allowed to govern a nation. By late 1857, the decision became inevitable. Early in 1858, the British government drafted legislation that would forever end the age of corporate empire, the Government of India Act. Debate raged, but the outcome was already clear. The act passed. And in a single stroke, quiet, bureaucratic, almost anticlimactic compared to the violence of the rebellion, the East India Company ceased to exist as a governing power. Its armies transferred to the Crown. Its territories absorbed into a new entity, the British Raj. Its administrative offices dissolved. Its officials dismissed or reassigned. its legacy swallowed by the structure that had once derived authority from it. The company was not merely dissolved. It was erased. Within a year, its name disappeared from legal documents. Within a generation, its memory faded from public consciousness. Today, its headquarters at India House stands in London as a quiet building with no plaque acknowledging the corporate empire that once ruled a fifth of humanity. But the karmic return did not end with the company's dissolution. It continued in the lives of individuals. Company officers who survived the rebellion often returned to Britain with broken nerves, haunted by what they had witnessed or committed. Some lived in quiet shame. Others boasted until their last breath. Some wrote memoirs. Others drank themselves into oblivion. Sepoys who survived were executed, exiled, or stripped of everything. Villages that participated in the uprising were destroyed, fines imposed with cruelty. The rebellion was crushed, but the wounds it revealed would shape India's future for generations. The deeper truth is this: the rebellion did not destroy the company. The company destroyed itself. It collapsed because it mistook obedience for loyalty. It collapsed because it replaced understanding with force. It collapsed because it believed profit was a substitute for legitimacy. It collapsed because it violated the spiritual fabric of the world it governed. Karma is not magic. It is the return of consequences. And the company, after centuries of taking more than it gave, finally received the bill. The end of the East India Company marked the death of an idea, the idea that a corporation could wield sovereign power without moral responsibility. It was the first great warning of the modern age. When an institution becomes powerful enough to distort the world eventually rises to correct it. There are funerals that pass quietly, witnessed only by those who loved the departed. And there are funerals that reshape the world. The dissolution of the East India Company was the latter, a silent burial that transformed global finance, corporate law, and the architecture of power for centuries to come. No bells tolled. No mourning procession walked the streets of London. No monument was built for the company that had once ruled a continent. Instead, a cold piece of legislation extinguished it, as though erasing a ghost. But ghosts rarely vanish. They linger in the structures that outlive them. To understand the company's death, imagine the atmosphere in London in 1858. The rebellion has been suppressed. India bleeds quietly behind the headlines. Parliament is exhausted, ashamed, and determined to prevent such chaos from ever erupting again. And so begins the company's wake, not a ceremony, but a dissection. Picture a long oak-paneled room in Westminster. Members of Parliament sit in a stern semicircle. Clerks shuffle papers. Ink pots gleam under the dim lamplight. On a table lies the corpse, not literal, but political, of the East India Company. Reports are read aloud, ledgers analyzed, petitions examined, witnesses questioned. The mood is not triumphant, it is forensic, because what they are performing is not just the dissolution of a corporation. It is an autopsy of power. The first revelation from the autopsy: the company had created the modern blueprint for multinational corporations. It pioneered the joint stock model, shares distributed, liability limited, profit pooled. This innovation changed the very nature of wealth. It separated ownership from labor. It allowed ordinary merchants to invest in global ventures. It democratized profit, but it also democratized risk. For the first time in history, wealth was no longer tied to land or lineage. It was tied to paper, the second revelation. The company was too big to fail long before such language existed. Its collapse during the rebellion threatened Britain's financial system. Its armies, its debt, its trade networks were so entangled with national stability that Parliament had no choice but to intervene. The third revelation. Corporate power can outgrow the moral frameworks that create it. For decades, Britain justified the company as a force for trade, knowledge, and civilization. But the company's actions, monopolies, famines, violent suppression, revealed something darker. When profit becomes the sole compass, ethics evaporate like mist under a rising sun. Parliament responds to these revelations with a decisive act. The Government of India Act dissolves the company entirely. Its territories become Crown property. Its armies become the British Indian Army. Its administrators become civil servants of the Raj. Its directors lose their influence. Its shareholders are compensated, but its soul is exorcised from the machinery of empire. But here lies the irony at the center of its funeral. The company died, but its ideas survived. And those ideas became the foundation of modern capitalism. Consider the ways its legacy endured. It pioneered modern bureaucracy, an organized, record-keeping, hierarchical system that governments around the world still replicate. It invented new forms of accounting, auditing, and internal oversight. It created the concept of governance long before the word became corporate jargon. It birthed the investor mindset, return on investment, risk hedging, market forecasting, shareholder value. It understood scale long before scalability became the holy grail of startups. And most importantly, it revealed a dangerous truth. When a corporation becomes powerful enough, it begins to behave like a state. This lesson frightened Britain. It fascinates economists, and it reverberates through every multinational corporation today. But the funeral also reveals something far more spiritual, something Parliament never examined, but India understood deeply. The company did not fall because of rebellion alone. It fell because its karmic balance sheet collapsed. For 2.5 centuries, it extracted wealth without replenishing it. It demanded loyalty without offering dignity. It claimed authority without understanding the land it ruled. It believed that order could be imposed rather than nurtured. When the rebellion came, it was not a surprise. It was an audit. Every injustice returned with interest. Every cruelty resurfaced. Every ignored grievance spoke aloud. Every act of greed compounded. And ultimately, the company's karma outweighed its capital. After its dissolution, Britain restructured its control of India under the Raj, an imperial government far more centralized, cautious, and regulated. The Crown took direct responsibility, recognizing that corporate rule had been a catastrophic experiment. Even Queen Victoria, whose portraits now hung in Indian courts and schools, understood that the company's demise was a warning about power without wisdom. But perhaps the most fascinating part of the company's funeral is what happened quietly, behind the scenes. Bankers studied its rise. Lawyers studied its contracts. Economists studied its collapse. Politicians studied its scandals. Industrialists studied its scale. And while the company was condemned publicly, its innovations were adopted privately. This paradox, the death of the body, the survival of the blueprint, is what makes the company's story so haunting. It died like a man. It survived like an idea. And ideas, unlike empires, do not crumble when the buildings fall. They linger in ledgers, in laws, in boardrooms, in modern corporate structures, in financial markets, in the very way companies today imagine growth. The company's funeral was not an ending. It was a transformation. If the company's funeral was the closing of a coffin, then what followed was the inheritance, the absorption of its bones into the architecture of global finance. For while the East India Company died on paper, its skeleton was quietly repurposed into the blueprint of the modern world. The men who dissected it in Westminster did not merely dismantle a corporation, they extracted principles, structures, and strategies that would guide capitalism for the next 2 centuries. To understand how deeply the company shaped the world that came after it, we must step into the minds of those who examined its remains. Picture a late evening in London in 1860. Rain taps softly against the windows of a banker's study. Gas lamps flicker over ledgers stacked like bricks. On the desk lies a thick, bound volume, Records of the East India Company. A banker flips through the pages. He sees risk distribution, dividend cycles, large-scale logistics, trade route monopolies, precedents for international arbitration, early forms of corporate governance. He is not judging the company for its moral failures. He is studying its financial genius. And he realizes something extraordinary. The company invented systems that no nation had ever built. From that point forward, financial institutions begin modeling themselves after fragments of its machinery. Insurance firms borrow its risk-sharing concepts. Shipping companies borrow its transport models. Investment houses borrow its understanding of scale and leverage. Governments borrow its administrative frameworks. Even central banks, still in their early evolutionary stages, observe its system-wide impact and take note. Because the company had achieved something unheard of, it connected global markets before technology existed to connect them. It sent capital across oceans faster than news could travel. It hedged against multiple economic environments simultaneously. It fused trade, military presence, and governance into a single power structure. It transformed distant lands into nodes of revenue. And for centuries after its death, the world would continue walking along paths it paved. Yet while admirers studied its brilliance, critics studied its failures. Consider the emergence of modern corporate law. The company's collapse revealed a terrifying truth. A corporation could destabilize an entire empire. No government had ever confronted such a problem. How do you regulate a company with its own army, How do you control a private entity that governs millions of people? How do you prevent shareholder interests from dictating foreign policy? These questions did not vanish when the company died. They became the foundation of corporate regulation. Legal scholars uncovered three major failures in the company's structure. Diffuse accountability. Directors could hide behind committees, agents, and provincial administrators, making it nearly impossible to assign blame. Perverse incentives. Profit was rewarded even when it created instability. Lack of transparency. Reports from India were often massaged, softened, or falsified. To fix this, Britain introduced new models of oversight: audits, disclosure requirements, independent boards, ministerial supervision. These would become standard in corporations worldwide. Meanwhile, economists looked deeper. They examined how the company managed liquidity, debt, and trade cycles. They studied its uncanny ability to create leverage without collapsing, until it finally did collapse. And from these studies emerged a new concept that now defines modern financial thinking: systemic risk. The company was the first entity whose failure threatened global stability. It was the original too big to fail. Its collapse forced Britain to intervene, restructure, and absorb its liabilities. Every modern financial crisis, from 1929 to 2008, echoes in the shadow of the East India Company. And then there were the philosophers. Men like John Stuart Mill, who worked within the company for decades, watched its downfall with complicated emotion. Mill, known for his writings on liberty and ethics, later argued that the company's collapse showed one essential truth: power without virtue corrodes itself. The company's story became a moral experiment, a demonstration of what happens when capitalism grows faster than conscience. Yet the most intriguing inheritors of the company's legacy were not bankers, lawyers, or philosophers. They were corporations themselves. In the decades after the company's dissolution, a new breed of multinational enterprise emerged: oil companies, mining syndicates, shipping conglomerates, railway giants, financial trusts. These new titans studied the company like a manual for empire building. They learned how to scale, how to manage global labor, how to influence governments, how to shape public opinion, how to operate across borders, how to survive crises, how to embed themselves so deeply into a nation's economy that no government could afford to dismantle them. The company had shown them the path. Now they walked it, carefully, strategically, often secretly. But perhaps the most unexpected inheritor of all was the British state itself. When the Crown took direct control of India, it didn't dismantle the company's systems. It absorbed them. The bureaucratic engine of the Raj, from district collectors to revenue systems, from military organization to judicial structures, was built on company blueprints. In a strange twist, the company became the parent of the very government that destroyed it. This is the deeper irony. The company died, but the Raj became its reincarnation. The new colonial administration was more polished, more moralistic in its rhetoric, and far more cautious, but the bones beneath the skin were unmistakable. And here lies perhaps the most profound aspect of the company's funeral. It marked the end of private empire, but the beginning of corporate capitalism as we know it. The company's demise was not a collapse. It was a transformation, a shedding of old forms, a diffusion of its essence into every corner of the modern world. And like all great transformations, it carried a spiritual truth. When a structure dies, its energy does not vanish. It changes shape. The company's greed became a warning. Its innovations became foundations. Its mistakes became doctrines. Its fall became prophecy. And the modern world, our world, emerged from its ashes. Funerals often bring clarity. They strip away illusions and force the living to confront the truth about the dead. And so it was with the East India Company. When the last administrative seals were broken, when its directors walked out of India House for the final time, when its coat of arms was lowered, the world could finally see the company not as a villain or a hero, but as a revelation, because the company's story is not just history. It is prophecy, a blueprint for the future written in the past, a warning disguised as memory. To understand what survived after the company's death, we must look at the inheritance Britain claimed, not the territory, not the armies, not the castles and forts, but the ideas embedded in its remains. Begin with governance. The British Crown, upon taking control of India, did not dismantle the company's administrative machinery. It polished it, centralized it, codified it. The district collector, an office created by the company, became the most powerful administrative role of the Raj. Revenue assessments, census operations, judicial authority, policing, all consolidated in a single figure, just as the company had done. This fusion of bureaucracy and power would later inspire colonial governments across Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. Even after decolonization, many nations retained these structures, unable or unwilling to unwind the machinery of centralized control. Next, consider the military. The company's army, once the largest corporate military in history, became the backbone of the British Indian Army. Its organizational principles, regimental culture, uniforms, command structure, logistics, nearly all of it was transplanted into the Crown's armed forces, and the influence spread outward. British officers who served in the company later led campaigns in Burma, Sudan, Afghanistan, and South Africa. American military strategists studied company campaigns to design their own doctrines. French colonial armies adopted similar regimental systems. The company's martial legacy echoed into modern warfare. Now look to finance. The company's methods of collecting revenue, land taxes, monopolies, excise, were adopted and refined by the Raj. Its accounting systems were integrated into government practice. The joint stock structure, once controversial, became the standard for major corporations across the world. The principle of limited liability spread across continents. Stock exchanges in London, Amsterdam, and New York grew in influence fueled by the model the company helped perfect. Even central banks, observing the company's collapse, began to craft policies to prevent similar chain reactions. Risk modeling. liquidity backstops, fiscal oversight, audit culture. All of these evolved because the company proved what happens when unregulated power grows too quickly. Then consider law. The company's rule produced a tangled web of legal problems, property disputes, land claims, taxation complexities, religious conflicts. To address these, British lawyers created legal frameworks that would become the foundation of common law institutions across former colonies. Modern Indian law, Malaysian law, Singaporean law, and even parts of African legal codes still reflect this architecture. Corporate law, too, evolved in response to the company. Oversight requirements, board accountability, public disclosures, stakeholder rights, anti-corruption statutes, anti-monopoly frameworks. Each of these was crafted because the company demonstrated what happens when they do not exist. But perhaps the greatest inheritance of all was the idea, quiet, subtle, powerful, that corporations should be treated with the seriousness once reserved for states. For the company had shown the world something terrifying. A corporation can accumulate power faster than a nation can regulate it. It can become international long before governments understand internationality. It can influence policy more effectively than the electorate. It can shape culture, rewrite borders, and dictate the flow of wealth. This lesson did not die with the company. It seeped into every major corporation that arose afterward. The oil giants of the early 20th century, the mining syndicates of Africa, the railroad empires of America, the banking behemoths of Europe, the tech conglomerates of the 21st century. Each inherited a piece of the company's ghost. Each wrestled with the same temptation to grow beyond oversight, to become essential to national security, to influence politics quietly from boardrooms, to operate not as a company, but as a kingdom. Because if the company taught the world anything, it is this: scale creates immunity. Immunity creates arrogance. Arrogance creates failure. The cycle repeats unless wisdom interrupts it. And that brings us to the spiritual core of the company's funeral. What died in 1858 was not just a business, it was an illusion. The illusion that profit justifies any structure. The illusion that control can substitute for understanding. The illusion that a system can outrun the consequences of its actions. The illusion that ambition, when multiplied by thousands, remains ambition rather than becoming hunger. The company's true legacy is not written in ledgers or law books. It is written in the human heart. When a person, a corporation, or a nation pursues power without balance, the world eventually responds, not with punishment, but with correction. Karma is not retribution. It is equilibrium seeking itself. The company lost equilibrium the moment it traded empathy for efficiency, culture for profit, identity for uniformity, understanding for dominance. Its collapse was not a tragedy. It was a rebalancing. And yet, from its ashes came modern capitalism. A system brilliant in potential, dangerous in excess, powerful in scale, fragile in morality. The company's funeral was not a burial. It was a warning, a whisper carried into the winds of the future. What you build echoes. What you take returns. What you ignore grows teeth. It is a message more relevant now than ever. If you listen closely, you can still hear it, the faint turning of a page deep within history's archive. Not the page of a king or a conqueror, but the page of a ledger. A ledger kept not in gold or ink, but in human consequence. The East India Company has been dead for more than a century and a half. Its fortresses crumbled, its warehouses emptied, its directors forgotten. Yet somewhere in the quiet spaces of our modern world, boardrooms, trading floors, supply chains, legislative halls, its echo lingers. The company's story is not merely a record of what happened. It is a mirror, a warning, a teacher. And as we stand at the end of this long arc of ambition and downfall, the final image is not one of ships or soldiers, not of thrones or treaties. It is a desk. On it rests a thick leather-bound book, the company's imaginary ledger, the sum of centuries of decisions. Open it, and you find no balance sheet, no revenue, no dividends, only consequences. On one page, the fort at Calcutta. On another, Clive's trembling hands as he signs his confession. On another, the poppy fields of Patna under a burning sky. On another, a sepoy kneeling with a cartridge he cannot bite. On another, the great hedge stretching like a wound across the plains. On another, China's coast under the shadow of gunboats. And on the last pages, Delhi burning in the heat of 1857. All entries, all debts, all echoes of choices made by men who believed they could command a world they did not understand. But the ledger does not end with them. It ends with you. Because every life, whether small or grand, carries its own ledger of decisions. You are writing one now. Every day, every habit, every ambition inked into pages that time will one day turn without your permission. Imagine, for a moment, closing the company's ledger and opening your own. The binding is humbler. The pages are blank. But the gravity is the same. Where the company wrote its entries in the lives of others, you write yours in the fabric of your days, your conduct, your intentions, your courage, your restraint. You may not command armies or govern nations, but you command something far greater, the direction of your own becoming. History does not repeat, they say, but it does rhyme. And the rhyme that echoes from the company's fall is simple, almost painfully so. Power without wisdom collapses. Wealth without virtue corrodes. Control without understanding cracks. Ambition without balance destroys itself. This is not a lesson for empires. It is a lesson for human beings. The same forces that shaped the company live inside each of us. Desire, fear, insecurity, greed, hope, impatience, ego. You felt these things long before you learned the company's story. You will feel them long after. But the point of history, true history, not the polite kind taught in textbooks, is not to memorialize events. It is to illuminate patterns, to whisper warnings, to place a gentle hand on your shoulder and say, quietly, look closely. This has happened before. Choose differently. The East India Company believed it could extract endlessly. people, land, culture, resources. It believed the world was something to be shaped through force. It believed progress was measured only in profit. It believed consequences were negotiable. These beliefs did not destroy it immediately. They made it powerful first. That is the trick of the world. Imbalanced choices often reward us before they destroy us. But the bill always arrives. So consider your own ledger. Every night, something inside you tallies the day. Not in numbers, not in currency, but in emotional arithmetic. Did your actions compound trust or erode it? Did your habits strengthen you or hollow you? Did your ambition expand your capacity or blind it? Did your choices create value or extract it? This ledger is not kept by the world. It is kept by your inner life, and the compounding is real. Perhaps more real than money ever was. Because when the company fell, its fortresses were lost, its armies dismantled, its flags lowered. But the consequences of its actions remained, carved into lands, into cultures, into entire nations. Your ledger, too, will leave echoes in your relationships, in your reputation, in your work, in the people you touch, in the opportunities you create or destroy, in the habits you pass to your children, in the dignity you either cultivate or abandon. History does not ask you to build an empire. It asks you to build a life worthy of its compounding. Stand for a moment at the edge of your imagined ledger. Feel its weight, not heavy with guilt or pressure, but steady, like a compass waiting for direction. Close your eyes and recall the world you've traveled through in this long story. A fort stifling in the heat of Bengal, a battlefield lit by the monsoon moon, a poppy field shimmering with poison under a golden sky, a queen riding into death with fire in her eyes, a hedge stretching like a scar across the continent, a boardroom in London where power whispered through ledgers, an empire collapsing not with a crash, but with a paperwork sigh. All of it, every scene, has carried a single, quiet truth. Wealth is not what you hold. Wealth is what you become through what you hold. The company failed this test. It mistook accumulation for ascension. It mistook control for capability. It mistook extraction for genius. It mistook silence for consent. It mistook stability for destiny. And so it collapsed under the weight of its own illusions. You, however, are not an empire. You are a single human being, alive in an age where history's mistakes are available as warnings rather than prisons. You have something the company never had: awareness. The chance to author your story with intention. The ability to pause before you act. The power to choose alignment over ambition, balance over hunger, clarity over impulse. Your ledger is still blank enough for reinvention. So ask yourself, what entries belong in a life you won't regret? What habits deserve compounding? What patterns must be broken? Which ambitions are worthy of pursuit? Which attachments must be released? Who do you become if your choices begin to align with the person you hope to be? The company believed legacy was measured in land and revenue. But legacy is measured in resonance, in the way your existence ripples into the lives around you. A gentle word, a courageous decision, a disciplined habit, a well-tended mind, a generous spirit, a boundary finally honored, a truth told at the right moment. These are the entries that build true wealth. These are the choices that compound across a lifetime. These are the echoes you leave behind. The company left a stain on history, but also a beacon. It showed us what happens when ambition loses its anchor, when power outruns wisdom, when wealth blinds the soul. And in showing us this, it granted us a gift, the ability to choose a different path. As you close this epilogue, imagine yourself writing the first line of your own ledger. Not with fear, not with pressure, but with quiet clarity. You are not an empire collapsing. You are a life beginning its ascent. The company teaches us the same truth whispered in older philosophies. You cannot escape the arithmetic of your choices. Not in empire building, not in wealth building, not in the quiet construction of a single human life. The question is not whether you keep a ledger. The question is whether you keep it consciously.